Yo guys, welcome to the Zelda fiction. Today we are gonna see, what if Naruto fell in love with Kakashi? Part 1. Huge shout out to what is left to say for this story. If you end up liking this video, please consider subscribe, so without further ado, let's get into the video. The first time it happened, Kakashi would swear it was an accident. In fact, he might even go so far as to deny it even occurred in the first place. He definitely did not lock lips with his student, not at all, not ever. He wouldn't, for regardless of his inner perverseness, he prided himself on being proper and respectful. He was Hatake Kakashi. He was sensei to the two saviors of the world, he was advisor to the Hokage in training, and he was leader of the dog summons. He was honorable, respectful, and very fearful of retaliation from a certain blonde Sannin with far too much strength in her fists. So, when his darling student tripped and stumbled over her own feet, he blamed what happens next on the fact that he could not override his instinct to catch her in her descent. He paid no heed to the ground that was freshly laden with rain, they were some of the most revered ninja in Konoha, and they did not lose their footing in mud. They were trained to walk on water, it was infeasible to even humor such an idea. Or so he thought, because the blonde Jinchuriki was in his arms and his feet were sliding, and Kakashi damned every ounce of water in existence as he fell backward. Silver hair turned brown as a wave of earth overwhelmed the both of them, but that was the furthest thought from his head. One wide grey eye met two cerulean ones in shared disbelief, as petal lips graced the masked ones of his own. He absolutely did not notice how soft her body was against his, nor did he acknowledge her warmth, and Hatake Kakashi did not revel in the moment long enough to linger. He did not, because that was improper, and the Hokage in training was too dignified and too innocent and too damn young to be in this situation with him. He would deny any of it until the day he died. However, when her tanned skin flushed to becoming rose color, he might own up to the fact that she was beautiful. He was taken aback by the situation, enraptured by the woman pressed against him. The sun had gilded her hair to the point of it shimmering as a frame of gold curtained around them. It was almost too much, he decided, and any man with any decency would be ensnared by her. He was helpless really, just a victim of circumstance. So when he did not immediately remove himself from the situation, he chalked it off to helplessness. When his hand settled upon her waist, it was only to help lift her from his person. And when his grey eye closed, it was only because there was mud in it and not at all because the woman before him was too radiant and he found himself blinded. When said blonde recovered from the shock and all but leapt up and away, so far away from his person, Kakashi did not mourn the loss of his darling student. Rather, he merely dismissed the situation as accident and bemoaned the mud hardening upon his vest. He certainly did not miss her warmth as it ebbed from his skin, nor did he sigh because he was stricken with a ghost of longing. It was indigestion, he decided, from laying down too quickly after eating. And when his red-faced student shook her head as if she could dispel the memory, he did not find her endearing. Hatake Kakashi dusted off what he could, made a quip about her owing him a new vest, and substituted himself out of the way of the ensuing roundhouse kick that would have knocked his teeth in. He acknowledged the wood as it splintered in his place, threw a half-hearted wave over his shoulder, and disappeared from the scene entirely. It would be 2 days before he returned to his post by his student's side at the Hokage desk. It did not go without notice how her cheeks tinted at his proximity, but if their fellow comrades had any questions about such a circumstance, they knew better than to voice their curiosity. Besides, Hatake Kakashi would deny anything that transpired on that fateful day, and his student had fists quicker than Tsunade's. The second time it happened, Tsunade abandoned his student at the Hokage's desk. She had thrown her hands up in indignation and stormed out of the room, leaving 3 villagers and one very startled blonde in her wake. As he walked towards the office, he could hear the Sannin yell "You deal with it," and proceed to growl about needing more sake to deal with ungrateful citizens. The slammed door that announced her departure from the building was loud enough to shake its very foundation, but he was unconcerned. Such was the price of peaceful times. He entered the room and found the 3 villagers staring in disbelief as they turned towards Naruto. Her hands were raised as if to show she was unarmed, but he noticed the gentle quiver to her shoulders. He was worried only momentarily, for the next second those same arms folded around her stomach and she shook with laughter that pealed brightly throughout the room. Then, as if a cord had snapped, the villagers joined in the humor at the Hokage's expense and the entire building sighed into the merriment. It was bright, he decided, a fitting scene for the woman standing behind the desk. Her long hair was tied back in the 2 ponytails he had come to adore, and he attempted to stifle his own amusement as he watched them sway back and forth in time with the laughter that escaped from her smiling mouth. He was pulled from his introspection when she stopped abruptly, pointed an accusatory finger in his direction, and yelled out that he was the one responsible for this mess. He did not flinch when he heard her signature, "Oi! Kakashi-sensei," growled out in a tone riddled with consternation. Instead, he nodded his head in feigned penance and agreed to whatever task she had burdened him with. It was easiest this way, he thought, as it yielded the least chance of a headache at the end of it all. He never could win an argument with the Jinchuriki, anyways. She was too hot-headed and stubborn, sometimes even more so than Tsunade, and it wouldn't do to dampen her mood. Not on a day like today, at least. 3 hours later, a very bored Kakashi was seen traipsing through the village with a sluggishness to his step. He was worn out, and the task was absolutely not worth his easy acquiesce to her demands, especially since he ended up with a migraine anyways. Sighing, he tucked his book into his jacket and leapt to the window of the Hokage's office. He was conjuring up the perfect way to iterate his annoyance at her previous demand, but every word that sat ready and waiting on the tip of his tongue fell silent as he alighted upon the ledge. The entire room felt suffocating, too dark and too sullen for the being seated in the center of it. He peered into the darkness as he held his breath, fearful to ruin the moment before he could adequately determine the reason everything felt so wrong. His eyes fell on the blonde hunched over the desk, her entity doused in shadows. Her glimmering hair was dull and lifeless, her skin seemed flat and gray. Her back was curved as if she was caving in upon herself. He noticed her hands were fisted into her sides, and in some small recess of his mind, he worried that she was going to tear into her shirt. Though the image before him was worrisome, he realized that it was not the most disturbing aspect of it all. It was her silence. In his entire time of knowing her, Naruko had never once been quiet. Her presence had always demanded notice, even when she was young. It was unnatural to not hear anything in the room, not her humming or the shuffling of papers or the sound of multiple clones working tirelessly in the background. It unnerved him, so much so that it made him hesitate. He did not know how to dispel this lapse of time, to rewrite the moment and make it back to what it was when he first walked into her office earlier that day. He moved from the ledge and all but stumbled to the front of her desk. He felt out of place, unsteady, as if anything he did from here on out would determine something more than just this moment. It mattered, he decided, and that bothered him. To see her so out of place, so out of her typical exuberance, was something he couldn't bear leaving to circumstance alone. He reached for his student with trembling hands, irritated that he could not quell his emotions enough to not depict his worry. But he found it was pointless as his eyes finally caught sight of her face. He froze. His outstretched hand fell still, his breath hitched in his throat, and his heart sounded loudly in his ears. She was crying. The rivulets of tears stood stark against her skin. They carved torrents down her cheeks, fell into a growing pool upon the desk, upon the papers that lay crumbled before her. The ink was running already, he noticed, but he could read the name, his eyesight keen even in the shadows. Jiraiya, it read. The stack was a set of his funeral papers, the ones that were needed in order to move his body from the rain country back to Konoha. We needed, she hiccuped, to bring him home, and as she shook, her small frame shrinking more within itself, Kakashi came to a very sudden and halting realization. What he was witnessing now was a monument falling, the stone head of the Hokage fracturing before it was carved. He was watching a hero shatter before him. He found himself choking around her name, stricken powerless to help the one who gave so much of herself just to save them all. Her hands unclenched themselves from her sides. They quivered as they lifted to wipe her tears away. I mean, Kakashi-sensei, she stuttered between the breaths that constricted her chest, I just didn't expect it was land requests and pleas for aid, and then this, her voice gave out mid-sentence, it brought back memories of everyone I lost so many friends. And then the great savior collapsed, and he could only watch as the sobs tore her throat open, and her head fell against her chest, as she dug her wrists into her eye sockets. She was trying to stop the tears from falling, trying to staunch the open wound, trying to prevent the inevitable. He could feel the weight of crushing defeat as it bore down upon her. The whole room heaved with her as sob after sob knocked against her ribs and ripped the strength from her heart. This, Kakashi thought, was unbearable. He had bore witness to many horrifying things in his life. First was his father who had fallen upon his own blade, and the blood and the mess and the loss of family and love. Next came Obito crushed beneath a boulder and more blood and more loss, and why couldn't he save them? Then came Rin, his hand pierced through her chest and more blood and silence and a broken promise. None of it, he shuddered, none of it was worse than this. This moment, right here, with his student falling so far beyond his reach, he worried he would never find her again, had struck Kakashi to his very core and rattled him beyond measure. This moment, he knew, would define his and her companionship for the rest of their lives. He could leave, right now, could run from conflict and lick his wounds in private as he was wont to do. He could save himself and leave her to her demise with none the wiser, he could trust that she would come back out of this with some semblance of her old self. She would never be the same, never be as vulnerable, open, honest as she used to be if he left her to her ruin. The thought of such an eventuality caused something to twist sharply within Kakashi's chest, it was a pain that wound its way far too deeply into his heart. He wondered where the air went, where the sun had gone, why the entire world seemed to run still. He faltered for an answer and came up with none. Staring at his comrade, the Hokage-to-be, his student, his friend, he understood his life had suddenly redirected itself to serve her own. His hands rose unbidden to catch her wrists, strong fingers steadied her shaking, and with a gentle but irrefutable tug, he pulled his student against his chest and entombed her securely in his arms. Her body rioted against his steady frame as the sobs became too violent for her to control. Even then, he thought he heard a sorry amidst all the breaking. A face, contorted in agony, buried itself against his chest. He could feel her teeth grind into his vest, desperate to silence her own suffering. "Stop that, Naruko," he insisted as his hand wove itself through her hair and distantly he questioned why she had taken it down. "You do not need to be quiet. No one is here to condemn you for hurting, it is okay. Everything is okay." But her teeth were stubborn and he wondered if she could hear him above her own cries. He decided it didn't matter. His ruined vest was replaceable, the wounded girl in his arms was not. He lifted her from the Hokage's chair, settled himself into it and curled around her as if to shelter her and her undoing from the rest of the world. This is where they stayed until the sobs became hiccups, until the hiccups became stutters, until her breath fell even and she tumbled into sleep. He spent that time running his hands through her hair, rubbing soothing circles into her back, tucking her more securely against his neck and chest as he murmured reassurances to her. It became both a mantra and a prayer to him, a ritual he repeated over and over again. He did not yield in his ministrations even after she fell into her slumber, too worried that if he stopped, she'd wake and crumble once more. It was well beyond midnight when Tsunade barged into the office, door ricocheting violently against its frame, and Kakashi leveled her with a glare that would have frozen an army in its tracks had they still been at war. He only relaxed when the girl in his arms remained sleeping, undisturbed by the unannounced intrusion. It was then that he noticed the redness to the Hokage's cheeks, the sloppiness to her attire, the fault in her step, but the minute she cast her eyes upon the scene before her, her spine went stiff as a rod. She walked over to her goddaughter, placed a steady palm against her forehead and counted. Once she ascertained that the general health of her precious person was not of critical condition, she cast a jutsu to ensure she would enter into a deeper sleep. Only then did she raise her voice to question Kakashi. When Kakashi's immediate response was to contort his face into something akin to fear and anguish, she asked nothing more of the copy nin. She reassured him that his student would rest easily tonight, that she would be okay, and that it was bound to happen eventually. Someone could only carry so much before they collapsed, but she reminded him of Naruko's inner capacity to overcome everything that threatened to ruin her. This moment today, she promised, would not be what did her in. That oath removed some of the tension that nestled itself into Kakashi's spine, and he sighed in hesitant relief. He reveled in the reassurance, because he, too, knew just how strong the woman in his arms had become. It was only when Tsunade raised her voice a second time that Kakashi found himself face to face with another conundrum. She can't be alone when she wakes up, Tsunade frowned, the unasked question sat heavily in the space between them. Kakashi realized he could do away with tonight. He had fulfilled his role as her sensei and friend, he had been there when she needed him. He would not need to face the aftermath if he just handed her off now to the arms of the Hokage. He trusted her, knew she would take care of his student and be there to console her in the morning. But something in him ached with a longing that made him respond before he considered the consequences that would surely come to light in the future. "I'll take her," he whispered, afraid that she would wake even under Tsunade's jutsu. "I'll make sure she's alright in the morning." Tsunade smiled knowingly and nodded her head. Her fingers interwove themselves in his gravity-defying hair and she ruffled it playfully. "Arigato, Kakashi-kun," she nodded her head and attempted to stifle a laugh as she did. She remembered the old days fondly, when young Kakashi would shake his head, as if to dispel her existence into nothingness. He was young but far too talented for such childish gestures, but of all the people to ever have been so intrusive, Tsunade was the only one who ever managed to be so close to him. She reveled in the fact that she could steal moments like this from the copy nin, even after all this time has passed. She leaned in, then, hands still entwined in his hair, and pressed her lips to his student's forehead, causing a blush to mark Kakashi's pale cheeks. "You're in good hands, Naruko," she whispered. Tsunade lingered there for a moment longer, lips pressed against her goddaughter's skin, and uttered a silent prayer for her companion's well-being. And with a quickness that rivaled Naruko's own, she removed herself from the two entirely and disappeared in a puff of smoke. It took Kakashi a few moments later to come back to his senses, the prior occurrence too intimate for him to fully comprehend. He shrugged his shoulders, cracked his neck, and made a quick conglomeration of symbols against his student's back in order to teleport them to his house. With her nestled securely in his arms, he found himself standing in the middle of his living room. He stood there for a moment, allowing the familiarity of the scents within his home to relax him further. It had been a long day, he concluded, and he was beyond ready for bed. The thought caused him to tense anew, however, when he pondered the sleeping arrangements. She could sleep on the couch, as she wouldn't wake for another few hours at the very least, and he was certain that was more comfortable than her previous position. However, the thought disgruntled him as propriety states the guest receives the best accommodation feasible, and that, he concluded, would be his bed. It took only a minute for him to begrudge his current situation, as he knew he would never rid her scent from the down of his nor from the threads of his sheets, but he yielded to the necessity of circumstance once more. Besides, when she wasn't saturated with Raymond, she smelled of the forest at sunset, the kind that lingered in the wildflower fields and belonged solely to her. It wasn't an unpleasant smell, in fact he found that he favored it amongst his entire team. It just did not belong in his bed as it wasn't proper, but it was an inevitable consequence of his situation, and so he relented all the same. He set the blonde gently upon the top of his bed, unlaced her sandals from her feet, and removed the jacket from her small frame. He frowned when he noticed just how skinny she had become. The war and the preparation to become Hokage had made her forget to take care of herself. Resigning to the situation at hand, Kakashi swore another oath to ensure her well-being by observing her eating habits and rectifying every time she did not consume enough to meet her nutritional needs. His student was becoming quite the handful, but he found her to be a burden worth bearing when she nuzzled sweetly into his pillow and seemed to relax into a deeper sleep. He lifted the blankets over her body, tucked them around her frame, and dimmed the lights. The moon seemed to sink beneath her skin, illuminating her in all the colors of silver and gray. It irradiated all the darkness that seemed to exist earlier in the evening. She seemed without sorrow and without fault, an angel untouched by the tragedy of this world. It endeared her to him, her innocence, and he found himself caught in the midst of an undeniable need to kiss her forehead the way Tsunade had. It was a sign of friendship, he reminded himself, a solidification of the bonds that lay between them. It was appropriate, given the length to the day and the trials that were sure to lay ahead of them. He justified his following act with every reason, but the one that entwined itself throughout his ribs and bound him more than chains ever could. A longing ran so deeply within him, the same one that made him ache when she was falling to pieces, that he could not deny its demands to be close to her, to protect her, to shield and nurture her light that he treasured so terribly much. It is with this realization that Kakashi pressed his unmasked lips to her forehead and stayed there for far longer than he should have. He entombed her scent into the very recesses of his mind in desperation to not lose, nor forget the person that laid beneath him. He decided, in that moment, that he would do anything within his power to never let her break the same way again. She would not suffer nor endure her heartache on her own. He would support her and stand by her side until the end of her days, he would shelter her from the darkness. She would never be alone again. Many hours later, daybreak announced its presence as the gentle light poured across Naruko's face once more, rousing her from her sleep. She woke to the scent of bacon and eggs and coffee. She was in an unfamiliar bed that smelled a lot like her sensei, and when she fumbled her way into the kitchen, her eyes widened in disbelief at the meal that awaited her. Kakashi had ordered her to eat every bite, but not before running a gentle cloth over her eyes to soothe the soreness from all the tears she shed the night before. She hiccuped, but he ran a soothing hand across her furrowed brow. "Think nothing of it, Naruko," Kakashi commanded as she let him console her once again, "now eat." For the first time in a long time, Kakashi's demands were not met with any opposition. The small girl ate every last bite, drank every droplet of coffee, and helped clean the dishes afterwards by insisting it was the very least she could do. When all was said and done, the toll of the tower's bell reminded them of their scheduled duties for the day. As she rose from lacing her sandals, Kakashi was rewarded with a blinding smile that was more genuine and radiant than ever before, one solely reserved for him. Cerulean eyes widened in unrestrained joy as tan fingers encircled his gloved hands and tugged him after her as she ran towards the Hokage tower. Yes, he decided, he had righted all that was wrong, and as he quickened his pace to match her stride, he furthered his resolve to ensure she remained as brilliant as she was this morning. The third time it happened, the blonde was in a set of 4, and all of them were bickering with an unseen companion. He could only assume that the demon, no, Kurama, inside of her was attempting to persuade her upon an alternative path, and such an attempt was being fraught with indignant refute. The noise in the room escalated to near unbearable decibels until 4 noses twitched in unison, and he found himself face to face with 4 sets of narrowed eyes. He paused only for a moment to notice how the setting sun painted those orbs azure, before he quickly turned on his heel and attempted a hasty retreat. However, 8 well-manicured hands fisted themselves into his vest, and he found himself face to face with 4 very stubborn, very obstinate, and very determined Jinchuricas. "What is it now, Naruko?" He sighed with more force than he intended and watched bemused as the bangs upon their foreheads ruffled in response to his breath. She hesitated only for a moment before she exhaled. He hid the cough that arose when her clones dissipated from sight, muffling the slight irritation at the smoke, before he redirected his focus to the main problem. The real body stood before him, eyes set in solid resolve. Her two hands alighted and took rain upon his cheeks, an act Kakashi found himself far too familiar with as he was subjected to it more often than propriety allowed. She was more comfortable around him due to all the time they spent together. She touched him far too frequently, he mused, but he found little ire to spare for such actions. He became used to them and the sudden warmth that rose within him in response to her gentle caresses. He even anticipated them, which lent itself to longing whenever his anticipations were unrewarded. He did not dwell on what that thought for too long, as propriety did not much allow for such emotions where she was concerned. It was all becoming far too complicated for him. He watched expectantly as her face underwent its familiar cascade of contusions. Confusion, hesitation, uncertainty, and determination flashed across her countenance. He was relieved she was an open book to read. He prided himself on being able to discern between the minor alterations that shed light onto the thoughts that resided in her head. She never spoke all of them out loud, but he could see them, feel them, and smell them, such that he recognized an emotion far before she even came up with the words to voice it. He almost always felt one step ahead of her that way, with one notable exception today. At this moment, the emotions within her blue eyes refused to settle. He gazed into those tumultuous waves within those orbs and could not help but to feel as if he was drowning. Out with it, he insisted, trying his best to hide the anxiety behind his command. Voicing his demand felt like coming up for air, and her immediate response to such a thing put the oxygen back into his lungs. Her shock at his sudden outburst was momentary at best, as he saw the shift in her stance to put the weight in the soles of her feet. She was prepared to fight, he realized, and her eyes steeled with insistence. "I want to drink to the falling," she exhaled determinedly, and he thought, for just a minute, that it was a joke. He was thankful for his years of self-restraint because the twitch in her fingers stalled the laughter that was on his tongue. It took her just a second too long to guard the pain that flashed across her eyes. She was anticipating his refusal and as such began bracing herself for the unfavorable outcome. The realization of such did him in. He could never bring himself to knowingly let her down. "Alright," he relented. She was of age, so it wasn't wrong per se. Propriety allowed for two friends to share a drink. Besides, there were worse things in life than a drunk woman. He decided that should such an eventuality occur, it was best that he was present to mitigate whatever consequences arose as a result. He did, after all, promise to protect her. And after many years of being her teacher, her motto of never going back on her word was engraved upon his heart as well. He sighed in begrudging resolve. However, he could not muffle his curiosity and queried, "Doesn't Kurama purify any alcohol?" He did not miss the fond smile she gave him when he used the QB's name, and he mentally patted himself on the back for remembering. Her smile soon fell victim to pearl-white colored teeth as she worried her bottom lip between them. "He is still depleted from the final battle," she exhaled in a rush, as if she was panicked. He'd decline her request. "If there was ever a time for me to get drunk," she sighed, "it's now, when he can't purify as quickly as I can assemble chakra. It will still have to be an excessive amount, but I want to feel as Hiro Sennin did, just once. Please." She stumbled now, hesitant to own up to the true reason she wanted to raise a glass to them all. She felt as if she wanted a deeper connection to those she lost, to imbibe and feel as her old sensei did when he was red-faced before her. Even greatness was fallible, and she wanted to be the same. She wanted to feel human, to feel less like the hero and more like Naruko. She didn't want to be the savior for tonight, she didn't want to be burdened by the praise that didn't feel she deserved. Now was the only chance she'd have at being a normal 18-year-old, and she'd be damned if she didn't utilize the opportunity. Still, she didn't want to wander into uncertain territory alone, and there was no one she trusted more than Kakashi. She tried to relay all of it by rubbing her thumbs across his cheeks to attempt to make him more amenable to the idea. She felt her shoulders full when he remained quiet for longer than she could bear. It was when her shoulders slouched that he remembered just how vulnerable she was. Memories of the day she broke branded themselves in his mind. He could feel the pressure ebb from her hand and realized she was getting ready to pull away. He nuzzled his nose into her palm to stop her. "Okay, Naruko. We will drink sake tonight," he explained, "my treat." The smile that rewarded him for his agreement was worth 1,000 of these moments. His easy consent was becoming worrisome for him, however. He was far too fond of her wide eyes, of the blush that tinted just the tops of her cheekbones, of the way her quivering lips steadied themselves in a form of unbridled joy. He was taken aback by the idea that he'd be content for the rest of his life should he be the only one to ever be the cause of such a smile. It was selfish, he knew, and improper. He should have denied her entreaty and removed himself from her. But he couldn't. He found that he simply did not possess the willpower to not yield to her requests. He was lifted from that line of thinking as her insistent hands fell from his face, moved slowly down his arms, and were once again enclosed around his gloved ones. He eyed her hand as if it was a traitor, but he relinquished himself to her claim. His fingers closed securely around hers, and he followed in her stead. They arrived at a bar close to his house, were directed to a booth secluded in the back, and were seated across from one another within minutes. He pondered just how quickly they had run to this destination, but paid little heed to the math when she unzipped her orange jacket. He could not comprehend how he had managed to take no notice of her attire before, as he did not think there ever was a moment in the entirety of her 18 years that Naruko Uzumaki wore a dress. But there she was, her golden hair spilling as a waterfall over her shoulders, pouring across a navy blue summer dress. Night met day in fond hello, as the gilded hair shone against the dark fabric, and Kakashi found himself breathless. She was beautiful, he knew, but tonight she looked radiant. The candlelight danced in her cerulean orbs, melting them into molten sapphire. The shadows that played across her cheeks softened her features. She was otherworldly, a being of captured starlight. He was mesmerized, enraptured, and wholly at her mercy. So, when she ordered 5 shots and insisted he consume them immediately with her, he nodded his head and obeyed. She repeated her request, and he could not manage to lift himself from his daze, enough to anticipate the consequences of yielding so easily to the woman before him. 10 shots later and he sat before an unfazed Uzumaki while he, himself, tried to steady the spinning room. I needed to stop 3 shots ago, he thought, but the blonde before him ordered another 5 rounds. When he finally managed to tear his eyes away from the vision before him, he found himself irritated at the onlookers. Their gazes lingered too long on Naruko, more than he thought was proper, and he half-humored the idea of rising and putting them all in their place. He relaxed as he eyed Naruko. The woman before him seemed unaffected by both the drinks and the attention. He was taken aback by the tenacity of her focus. It rested on him, on his words, and on the drinks that lie before her. She paid no mind to anyone or anything else. With every shot, she breathed a name as if in prayer, trying to entomb them within herself in both memory and practice. It was an act of reverence, he soon came to realize. 15 shots later and Naruko finally had rouge-colored cheeks. In retrospect, Kakashi probably should have stopped her there, taken her back to her house, and tucked her into her bed after she drank some water. He knew better, but decided against following his rules, and instead watched entranced as she consumed another 5 shots of sake. Her face reminded him of the first accident, her blue eyes were hooded, and her cheeks were stained with rose. It suited her too well, he decided, and made her look far older than she was. One of the straps to her dress hung off of her shoulders, giving him a view of the swell of her breasts. In some small aspect of his mind he wondered when it was that she grew into her womanhood. He tried to attribute her development to a specific year, but came up lacking. It was because she always wore that jumpsuit, he decided, but even that excuse seemed fallible to him. He thought that he should fix her dress for her, since she had no intention of doing it herself, but he could not will his hand to move. Her attire now had him questioning his decency, and as such, he considered the idea of putting the porn away in order to irradiate his mind from his newfound inappropriate tendencies. The horror of such an existence immediately squashed that idea, however. He would just have to be a lecher. Her face rested in the palm of her hand as she eyed him quizzically. She seemed to ponder him and his countenance, and he found himself once again unnerved by his student. Her eyes were too much to take in, he relented, the blue too changing in the candlelight that it felt like he was lost, for the second time that day, at sea. He couldn't discern the grays from the shades of blue that rested within them, and with his Sharingan, such a feat should have been feasible. Yes, he decided, it was the candle to blame for his inability to concentrate. With the blame being firmly established in his mind, Kakashi was once again distracted as one hand found its way around his cheek and wove itself against his jaw. He faltered as all thoughts fell from him and paid far too close attention to her lips as they formed around the syllables. They were stained with the color of the berries she had eaten earlier, painting them delectable and tempting. "Nah, Kakashi-sensei," she breathed, "I think I finally understand it all now," she sighed as her head tilted to further emphasize her curiosity. She leaned forward, and he only briefly acknowledged a spilled drink that cluttered between them. His first response was terror, as he half anticipated a certain Sannin barging into the place with a fist aimed at the ready to launch itself against his jaw. His eyes darted to the door, irrational fear ruling his actions before he had the sense to stop them. His student was too close, too earnest, and he couldn't foresee the restraint either of them had to stop her. His fright rendered him more coward than brave, as his 2 hands immediately took their place amidst the blonde's shoulders. He needed to get them out of the line of potential danger, as word of her intimate actions would surely result in a blonde Hokage at that door any millisecond now. With as little of a warning as a twitch of his brow, he and his student suddenly reappeared on his couch in the safety of his home, the sound of falling coins the only reassurance to the barkeep that he had owed up to the bill him and Naruko had generated. The Jinchuriki fell against him, her drunken state too foreign for her to adjust to the slowness that resulted from it. He heard an "I'm sorry" muffled against his chest as she pushed herself away from her teacher, but the awkward position had unsettled her. He found himself holding his breath as his student shifted against him. Du-Tan knees dug into his hips and he tried his damnedest to not acknowledge the compromising situation before him. He watched her face as she altered her position slowly, and the unbidden yearning to just stop her stimulating movements had caused him to dig his fingers into her hips. She yelped and ceased her motion, an outcome that Kakashi was grateful for. Had she continued in her actions, a different and much more improper response would have arose from the Jounin. That, he knew, could never happen as that was the epitome of indecency. Blue eyes met one gray one as once again, he found himself far too close to his student. He wondered, distantly, when the alcohol would wear off of her, when she would realize the compromising position the two of them were in and remove herself from his person entirely. He had hoped it would be soon, as the fingers that initially dug into her hip had suddenly relaxed themselves enough to become caressing. He had attempted to mitigate such a reaction, but found himself helpless. He questioned when it was that he so willingly fell victim to her actions and pondered if he should perhaps do more to avoid situations like these in the future. Cobalt eyes fell half closed as her hands rose to the edge of his mask. They danced along it, never attempting to pry it off of his face, but he inwardly noted that they left trails of fire in their wake. He could not breathe around the name that hitched itself once again in his throat. Her eyes shifted in their emotions, from curiosity to hesitance to a need that made Kakashi adjust uncomfortably in his seat. "Nah, Kakashi-sensei," she breathed as her words came slow and heavy from her tongue. He could only watch as she struggled to form the words, paying far too close attention to the tongue that clicked against her teeth. He wondered what she would taste like and immediately berated himself for such indecent thoughts. He was lifted from his reverie when two hands tucked themselves beneath his mask and against his cheek, her fingers far warmer than his own skin. He attempted to voice his protest, but there she was, before him, all innocence evident by the flush that stained her skin. In that moment, Kakashi knew he was in dangerous territory. He understood the consequence of such a situation, that such an intimate position between the two of them would forever decide their interactions from here on out. He could vanish before her, leave her to his apartment, and be exempt from further inclusion to her life than that which he partook in now. But, he found he could not lift himself from this moment, could not generate enough of a need to be away from her. So, he decided, he'd leave it to her. In hindsight, it was careless since she was riddled with alcohol, but it would pass. She would comprehend the wrongness of their circumstance and remedy her mistakes. Never mind that it felt far too right to have her pressed against him. She would remember he was her teacher and react in line with propriety. That was what he believed to be best, anyways, and so it was of little consequence to prolong their interaction. He just had to be patient until she eradicated the alcohol in her system. "Please," she exhaled, and the plea was not lost to him. He tensed from his toes to his jaw as his hands buried themselves mercilessly into her hips, wrinkling the dress he had come to love. She did not falter as her fingers dug further beneath his mask and continued in their movement to remove it from his person. She just looked too damn innocent, he decided, and he would not live knowing he denied her anything. Of all the people in his life, she deserved to know and see the truth. And maybe, just maybe, he was too tired of being hidden. He spent far too long in the shadows, it was time he be lifted into the light. Hand fingers undid his only security as a pale face laid unmasked before her. The intake of breath that followed unsettled him, and he found himself trying to create any excuse to just leave. He was already peeling away from her, trying to establish distance in the wake of their intimate proximity. She must have sensed his impending departure, as her thighs tightened around him and those same fingers curled around his jaw, weaving their way to the back of his ears. He pondered whether or not she knew just how sensitive that place was to him, but the thought was forgotten as her fingertips fell still. She had ensnared him and he was lost to her. "So beautiful," she breathed as she leaned closer towards him. "It's unfair, sensei," was her excuse as her lips crashed upon his unmasked ones. He flinched as if he was struck, and he might as well have been as all his nerve endings fired at once. He could not settle on a thought long enough to make sense of anything. One moment she was soft and gentle and innocent, and the next she was closer to him than before, and insistent and so delectable that she was open-mouthed and tasted of honey and berries and hint of ramen, a mixture he soon decided he could taste for the rest of his life because it belonged solely to her. She tasted like summer months. He felt like he was kissing sunlight, caressing fire. It was 11 o'clock at night, but Kakashi was being burned alive by a rising sun. What a way to go, he thought, and he relinquished himself to the flame pressed so tenderly against him. She breathed his name like a prayer against his lips, and Kakashi suddenly found his entire universe rearranging to place her at the center. She pulled away and Kakashi mourned the cold. He could not catch his breath, and judging by the rise and fall of her chest, neither could she. Her hooded eyes and parted lips were the epitome of perfection, and her long unbound hair fell gently against his forearms. She leaned forward once more, lips pressed against his jugular, as she whispered against his neck. You shouldn't hide from the world, Kakashi, and he tried his best to listen to her words more than pay attention to the movement of her mouth against his throat. And again, she sighed, I wouldn't mind being the only one to know you like this. She pressed herself closer as she settled against him, her hands moved downwards to rest on his chest. I like being this close to you. The confession resounded loudly in Kakashi's mind, but her voice was barely a whisper. Had he not been keen of hearing, he might have missed the words entirely. 2 minutes later, perhaps less, and the blonde seductress was asleep against him. Kakashi remained in that position for another 30 minutes, attempting to reassemble some kind of sanity amidst the chaos of his mind. He found that he could not establish order and subsequently dismissed the probability of ever achieving such a goal. The woman before him had rewritten his entire existence and stained all of it with gold and orange. He acknowledged that drunkenness perhaps played a significant role in the outcome, that she might wake in the morning riddled with regret, that their relationship might forever be heavied with the awkwardness that was sure to follow, but he found that he didn't care. She walked into his life and gilded it with light, it was only fitting that their kiss held that same brilliance. She ignited him, warmed the dark recesses of his being, and lifted him from the shadows like a phoenix from the ashes. It didn't matter what the morning brought or what the future held, it did not affect nor change his oath to protect her. She was his entire world, and he'd see fit to keep her safe. With his resolutions clearly set in place, Kakashi gently tucked his student against his frame, rose from his couch, and once more placed her in his bed. He envied the moon that sank beneath her skin and yearned to be that close to her, but with one last kiss upon her forehead, he left her to her dreams. He closed the door silently behind him, but he did not miss his name as she breathed it into the pillow. Kakashi fell heavily onto the couch, unbound and untethered to everything but the woman sleeping in his bed. Consequences could be damned, he thought. None of it mattered anymore. All that mattered was her. With all the heaviness of a setting sun, Kakashi fell into a deep sleep. He dreamt of sunlight dancing across cerulean seas, and everything was warm. The 4th time it happened, Kakashi was roused from his slumber by an incessant knocking upon his door. It was quiet but repetitive, and he hesitated before answering it in hopes that whomever it was would just go away. He wearily eyed the clock, bemoaning the early hour. It was 4 in the morning, it was ludicrous that any person should even be awake, let alone bothering him. Sighing, he donned his mask and put on his shirt, drawing out the process in the last attempt for the problem behind his door to suddenly correct itself and leave him to his peace. He was unrewarded for his effort, as the knocks gained in insistence and strength and would soon result in his headache. He begrudgingly slumped his way through his living room and stifled his yawn as his hand grasped the doorknob, opening the door slightly enough to peer through the crack. This proved to be futile, as the dilemma that not so patiently waited for his attention soon stumbled and lost her balance once again, forcing her entry by falling into his arms. He steadied her in her descent by counterbalancing her weight, having learned from the first time she accidentally tripped. He briefly registered how cold her skin felt as her hands fisted themselves in his nightshirt. After a few seconds of catching her breath, blue eyes gilded silver in the moonlight rose to meet his questioning gaze. I'm sorry, she whispered as if she was afraid to disturb the early morning peace. He mourned the loss of his sleep when he realized there was more to this visit than a simple hello. What is it, Naruko? He asked as he ensured she was stable on her own before moving to close the door behind him, the weather too cold for his liking. If he was forced to remain awake, he might as well be warm doing it. The blonde stood behind him and shivered. As he waited for her response, he took a moment out to note her appearance. She was soaked to the bone, her sopping nightgown stuck closely to her skin and left very little to the imagination. Swallowing suddenly became difficult as his eyes moved down her form, taking in the fact that her unbound hair looked like melted amber as it fell slickly to her hips. It was only when her body shook once again that he recalled the coldness to her skin. He eyed her warily, waiting not so patiently for the explanation she owed him. Noticing this, Naruko attempted to speak in spite of her chattering teeth. A pipe broke in my apartment. She shook her head to rid the water droplets falling from her bangs, and it won't be fixed until later today, and it's 20 degrees outside, and my clothes are ruined, and I brought this extra set with me, but it's wet too, and Sasuke and Sakura are out on a mission. Iruka-sensei is not at his place, and I have nowhere else to go, she exhaled in a rush before wrapping her arms about herself in a desperate attempt to preserve some heat. I'm sorry, I know how early it is, she sniffled as tears seemed to pool in her wide eyes. Kakashi hesitated only a moment as the sudden realization hit him. She was going to cry. That absolutely could not happen, as memories of the past rose up before him and chilled his spine. He was wholly unequipped to deal with it this early in the morning, and in a sudden flurry of panic, he had thrown towels at the soaked blonde, grabbed her by the shoulders, and all but lifted her into the shower herself, before promptly shutting the door behind him. He admitted that his actions were probably too hasty and too brash, but for the moment the crisis had been averted. Upon hearing the shower turn on, he tried impossibly hard to not think of the blonde naked in his bathroom, but failed miserably. 15 minutes later, and he heard the shower turn off. Another 3 minutes after that, a still wet but warm blonde suddenly appeared in his living room in nothing but a towel. Kakashi barely registered the blush on her cheeks before his mind malfunctioned on him. There she was, a being of captured sunlight, naked in his living room inside his apartment alone with him in nothing but a towel. He cursed every god in existence for a situation like this and attempted to hold on to what little was left to his self-control. Naruko shifted uncomfortably before him, too embarrassed to voice her request. She had no usable clothes and would not have any until the problem at her apartment was fixed. And while she was incredibly warm and very thankful to Kakashi for saving her from dying as a popsicle, she was now helpless to clothe herself. She was about to plead for another favor from her sensei when she was stopped mid-breath as the door swung open, revealing one very shocked Hokage. While he was thankful for the distraction from his improper line of thinking, Kakashi witnessed his life flash before his eyes. The Hokage twitched and he knew he was done for. Tsunade spared one glance between the Jounin in his pajamas and her goddaughter in nothing but a towel before her vision stained red. Righteous fury burned within her palms as they fisted and proceeded to launch themselves at Kakashi. He didn't attempt to intercept her and merely closed his eyes and accepted his fate, bracing for impact. When it did not come, he opened his eyes to see a white towel hugging tan skin. He traced the skin up an elegant arm and a lovely elbow bearing a peculiar freckle to a slender wrist and further to tan fingers curled around a trembling ivory fist. "No, Bachan," Naruko exhaled through gritted teeth, "it isn't what it looks like," and shifted her weight to more strongly hold back the punch that tried desperately to continue in its trajectory. "Let me go," Naruko the Hokage commanded, "you will heed my order." "I will not," she growled, "he helped me. You're misunderstanding, and if you just relax for a minute I'll explain everything to you, but I'm not going to let you hurt someone who came to my aid." The words seemed to do the trick. She felt her godmother release the force behind her punch and unwound her fingers to let Tsunade go. The Hokage huffed indignantly and stepped back. "Explain, Naruko. You have only a minute before I finish what I started," she demanded as she crossed her arms over her chest. Naruko gave Kakashi an apologetic look before redirecting her attention to the task at hand. She recounted the events that happened earlier that morning and finished by explaining how she ended up in the living room with only a towel to cover herself. While the two were distracted, Kakashi snuck into his bedroom and contemplated disappearing from the village entirely. He did not trust Tsunade to retain her temper and did not much enjoy spending his morning fearing for his life. However, his student was in need and he did not have it in him to deny her anything. As a consequence of his weakness, he now had one of his old shirts in his hand and returned to meet his demise in the living room. The grateful Naruko wove one hand around his shoulder in a quick embrace to thank her sensei, while the other hand remained fisted in the towel to keep it steadily in place. Kakashi was suddenly overwhelmed by smells of the forest and wildflowers and instantly calmed. However, the moment did not last as he warily eyed the Hokage over her shoulder. As Naruko pulled away and all but ran back into the bathroom to change, Tsunade instantly bridged the distance between them. Her face twisted into something of confusion and appreciation and her brown eyes simmered with conflict. Within a moment, all hesitation ebbed from her stance and she smiled warmly at the Jounin before her. She reached up to ruffle his hair and laughed. "Omen Kakashi-kun," she giggled at his shocked expression, "you see, I am sorry for jumping to conclusions so quickly. When it comes to Naruko I am just a little bit overprotective." She finished her apology by tapping his nose with a pointed finger. He was still trying to make sense of the whirlwind of her emotions when she blindsided him with what followed. Her hand moved down to straighten the collar of his nightshirt, an act of familiarity that completely disarmed him. "You're a good man, Kakashi-kun," she patted the area above his heart, "you have my approval." And with that, she was gone from his home entirely. A quiet click as the door fell closed was the only announcement of her departure. Kakashi settled exhaustedly into his couch feeling defeated as he tried to comprehend the meaning behind her words. He could not fathom why they weighed so heavily in his mind. He was so distracted by his inward brooding that he completely forgot about the blonde Jinchuriki in his home. So, when gold hair swished before him and sun-kissed fingers lifted up his chin, he was shocked out of his introspection. "Thank you, sensei," she smiled as she reached for his hand. He nodded his head, too bewildered by the fact that she was in his shirt and found it difficult to breathe for the second time that day. It only covered her to her mid-thigh and hung loosely off her shoulders, giving him unabridged access to her collarbones and the arch of her neck. It reminded him of her lips against his jugular and he suddenly recalled a certain list. He swallowed roughly and attempted to hide it in a cough, thankful that she seemed to not notice his inward struggle. An insistent tug once again pulled his attention from his mind to reality as he was lifted out of his seat. He leveled her with a curious gaze as she smiled sheepishly in response. Before she could answer, a rumbling sound emitted from her stomach and she blushed in embarrassment. Kakashi found it endearing as he directed her to his kitchen. He tried to hide his amusement as she sat in a chair and anxiously awaited food. He cooked enough for 4 people, as Naruko consumed 3 times the amount of a normal person. A plate of bacon, eggs, and potatoes were placed before her, and she exhaled a hurried thank you before immediately diving into the meal. He removed his mask, the need for secrecy no longer pertinent in the wake of past events, and noticed the blush that once again painted her cheeks with rose. She must remember, he mused, and hid a chuckle behind a sip of coffee. As he ate his portion of the meal, he came to the realization that this was not a bad way to start the morning after all. It was far too easy for them to talk to one another, and they soon found themselves engrossed in conversation. He refilled their cups of coffee as she regaled him with some of her and Jireya's adventures. In turn, he spoke of his and Minato's exploits, and she was captivated by the man before her. It was well past noon when Kakashi finally rose to clear the plates between the two of them. Naruko was contently playing with the ends of her hair as she drawled on about all the lessons she still had to complete before taking over as Hokage. He reminded her of her innate ability to mass replicate herself, such that each clone could read a book each and she'd be done within hours. He was taken aback by the sudden rigidity to her shoulders that belied her nimble movements. Between 1 second and the next, Naruko had slammed her hands against the table and rose in heated determination. "I will not," she all but yelled, "take the easy way out on this one, sensei. I must devote the time and effort and energy so that I understand every facet. One cannot be Hokage if they cut corners." Kakashi found himself wide-eyed before her. Her eyes were hardened sapphires, her lips were set in a thin line, and everything in her stance served to emphasize the edge in her words. However, a piece of bacon hung amusingly in one of her bangs, and somewhere in the recess of his mind, he imagined her at a meeting between nations, looking exactly like this, resolute and serious, except for the small leftover breakfast in her golden tresses. The image caused an unbidden laugh to resound brightly throughout the room. Naruko, savior of the world, could prevent calamities and overcome impossible odds, but could not manage to keep food from her hair. It was too much, and the dirty dishes sat unattended to as his hands found their way to his stomach as he doubled over in unrestrained laughter. Naruko felt all stiffness ebb from her spine as she tried to recall a moment when she had ever heard Kakashi laugh. He would chuckle, chortle, or cough, but never laugh like he was doing now. It was so unguarded and so genuine that she was taken aback by how beautiful this moment was, with dirty dishes lining the space between them as the sun poured over the man overcome with merriment. It was happiness, she realized, pure, unbridled joy. The whole room seemed brighter, more surreal, and she knew that if she could freeze any aspect of time, it would be this moment right here. Her eyes softened as she felt a shifting in her heart. Her entire world seemed to place him at the pinnacle of her skies, as if all the movements of the wind and seas suddenly made sense. The darkness she was stranded in since birth was suddenly inundated with the liquid silver light of the moon. And, at 1 in the afternoon, Naruko finally found something she wanted more than the title of Hokage. So, with all the care and gentleness of silence, Naruko climbed onto the table on her knees and navigated the plates enough to bridge the distance between her and Kakashi. And, as one of his hands rose to wipe the tears of joy from his eyes, her tan hand stalled them in their path. His fell to his sides in quiet surrender while hers continued in their ascension. One found its rein behind the curve of his jawbone, right behind his ear, while the other alighted upon his cheek. Her thumb caught the falling tear and gently stroked along his cheekbone, and between one heartbeat and the next, her lips eclipsed with his. And, for the first time in all of her years, she felt whole. She pulled away and his eyes tried to catch hers, but she was already on her feet, standing, turning to grab the dirty dishes. He was at a loss for words as he tried to comprehend the burning and the longing and the sheer need for the woman before him to remain close to her. To fold her into his arms and entomb her in his heart where she already took reign. But she was turned from him, now, at the kitchen sink, the sound of running water the only noise in the once jovial room. He fumbled for words, for a way to transcend the moment in order to arrive at the next, in order to establish steady ground, but he had no syllables at his disposal. As such, he did the only thing he knew how to do, follow in her lead. He collected the remainder of the dishes and met her at the sink. She smiled as she held out her arm, silently requesting the plates he held within his own. He placed them in her hands as if they were a peace offering, and she nodded in acceptance. She started humming, a song similar to what Kushina used to sing, and the melody made him halt in his actions. He eyed her with all the weight of the world as he tried to dispel the voice and the memories it caused to surface in his mind. He was 5 years old again in Minato's kitchen, Kushina singing before the stove. She smiled at him, Naruko's smile, he realized, as she read him the recipe. He reached for her in a desperate attempt to preserve the happiness of the moment, but Kushina dissipated before him and melded into the blonde-haired, blue-eyed ray of sunlight standing before him. He felt like he was drowning, like he was seeing a ghost, like he was an orphan all over again knocking on the door of his sensei's house without ever being let in. He choked around the sob that lodged itself in his throat. He could not reconcile his past with the present, and it was going to be his undoing. Naruko could feel the turmoil emanating off of Kakashi, but she could not fathom the cause to the drastic change in his demeanor. Anxiety threatened to undo her calm facade, but something in the way his fingers trembled just the slightest steadied her. Kakashi looked young, younger than she had ever seen him, in the way his wide eyes could not shield the pain swirling within them. He was a tornado unbound and untethered, and she realized all he needed was somebody to bring him back to earth. So she did what she imagined anyone would do in a situation like this and reached up with gentle fingers to soothe his furrowed brow. He softened beneath her touch and uncoiled some of the rigidity in his spine. She smiled, hummed a sigh of relief, and asked him for the soap in hopes that it would fully irradiate the tension that settled itself in his shoulders. He blinked as if he was coming out of a daze as handed her the bottle and was taken aback when the simple act felt a lot like coming home. Just like that, the heaviness of all the moments before eased once again into companionship and Kakashi was at peace. Half an hour later, Naruko was dressed in the extra set of clothes she brought with her in the morning that were dried after hours of hanging in the sun. She had received word that her apartment was fixed and as a result, she needed to return to establish order to the mess that surely awaited her. She hesitated at the doorway before wrapping her arms around Kakashi. "Thank you," she whispered into his chest, "honestly, thank you. You didn't have to help me today, and I know it was early, but truly Kakashi, thank you." His arms fell reassuringly around her frame as he gave her a gentle squeeze. He held the embrace for as long as she allowed, and when she began to move herself from his person, he moved his hands to her shoulder. "I promised you I would help you," he reminded her gently, "I meant it, Naruko." He leaned forward to press a kiss to her forehead, an unbidden fondness necessitating the act before he could stop it. Something about the kitchen anchored him to her, and he was not quite ready to let her go. Seizing the opportunity, she hooked one of her hands inside of his pockets and tugged. He pulled from her, startled out of the intimacy, as she jumped out of his reach before bridging the distance once more to capture one of his hands between both of hers. Her mischievous smile was the only warning he had before he suddenly appeared in her apartment. He landed not so gracefully in a pile of wet clothes and tried his best to maintain his cleanliness as he attempted to extract himself from the mess. He looked up at the blonde helplessly as she giggled at him in amusement. "Help me with this," then she exhaled through fits of giggles, "Please sensei." She could not help but to pride herself on being clever. Her quick thinking had ensured he would not dwell too much longer in the past after her departure and also secured aid in cleaning her apartment. She was far smarter than she gave herself credit for, and her smugness must have emanated more than she intended as a wet sweater suddenly launched itself at her face and soiled her hair. "If you have the time to stand there and laugh, you might as well be of use while you're doing it," came the stiff voice of her sensei, "We do not have all day, Naruko." She tried to stifle the last of her amusement as she helped extricate him from the waterlogged laundry that currently entangled him up to his knees. She bounded away from him at the completion of her task and returned with a basket. Gomen, sensei," she grinned up at him as she started folding the clothes, "I really do appreciate you volunteering to help me out of another dilemma." She dodged another flying article of clothing before falling once more to another set of giggles. Kakashi stifled his consternation at her antics and redirected his focus to the task at hand. As he carefully maneuvered about her apartment, he snuck glances at the woman across the way. The setting sun had gilded her hair the ember of a flame and melted the sapphire of her eyes. The light poured across her skin in a silent embrace, softening her outline so much so that for a moment she looked purely ethereal. He had to stop himself from reaching out to touch her to ensure she was real and instead focused on her voice as it resonated throughout the room. The familiar song she hummed held him in fond memories instead of the turmoil of his past. And, at 6 in the evening, Kakashi thought he would clean her apartment many more times for just another moment like the one they were in now. She caught his gaze and smiled, the kind she reserved only for him. She was radiant, even as she was now, kneeling amidst piles and piles of laundry, with her unbound hair shimmering in the light of the setting sun. Yes, he thought, give him 1,000 early mornings and 1,000 more messes, he would partake in them all, so long as she was in them. The 5th time it happened, Tsunade's voice all but erupted around Kakashi's name as she summoned him to her office. He heaved a heavy sigh before extricating himself from the shadows to move to open the door. When the door did not give way to his insistent push, he added more force to his flattened palm and clenched his jaw with the effort. Frustration bit at his shoulders as he wished, not for first time that day, that he had stayed home and feigned illness. Anything, he groaned, would have been better than the hassle he was dealing with now. He could hear Tsunade's string of curses, but her voice seemed stifled and he could not reason why. Another hushed voice spoke in whispers, quick in its urgency, but though it was familiar, he could not put an owner to it. He ground his teeth against one another and put more pressure on the door as the wood gave slightly to his strength. It would not be the first time that the door to the Hokage's office had been broken, but he did not want to pay for the damages that would arise from it happening on his behalf. Kakashi's patience wore thin. Money could be damned, he consented, and his hand folded into a fist. In an attempt to vent all of his frustration, the door splintered beneath the punch that rioted against it. A startled yelp resounded in his eardrums, and in the quickest act of familiarity, Kakashi's arm circled around the falling form, steadying her in her descent. "Naruko," he breathed, and the surprise in his voice was eminent. He straightened the two of them before hastily letting her go, thankful for the mask that hid the blush at her proximity. Hot Aki Kakashi did not blush, and it would be ill-suited had Tsunade borne witness to the fact that he most certainly did blush, and blush often, when it came to his sunny-haired student. Said student suddenly pressed her palms against his vest and all but shoved Kakashi towards the doorframe, ushering him out of the room. He resisted, and a grunt escaped her small body as he remained unmovable before her. His eyes scanned the room and widened marginally at the sight before him. Tsunade was in her chair, held down by 6 of Naruko's clones. The 7th had her tan fingers over the Hokage's mouth and shook her head furiously in a desperate request for the angry leader to remain silent. Tsunade's glare fell on the back of the real Naruko's head, and Kakashi knew that had Naruko seen it, she would have gulped. He, himself, was half tempted to, but was once again thankful for the years of practiced stoicism that allowed him to keep his reactions hidden. "Sensei, please," Naruko pleaded, but the headache that threatened to bloom behind his eyelids rendered him merciless. Pale fingers rose to encircle her wrists, and the gentleness to the act belied his strength. Suddenly the real Naruko was faced away from him, towards the Hokage, while her arms were pinned behind her. He moved so quickly that her hair had not fallen still before his chin was on her shoulder, and with a voice as quiet and steely as a glacier, Kakashi spoke. "Naruko," he drawled, "pray explain what, exactly, is going on here." And Naruko flinched as if ice had pooled across her spine. The hitch in her breath was satisfying for Kakashi, and he thought that perhaps today would not be such a waste after all. She did well to hide her trembling, but he was too attuned to her to not notice how much control she had to exert in order to do so. He could feel the acceleration to her pulse and the tension to her shoulders. He knew it was with determination and a wealth of stubbornness that her voice remained steady when she responded to him. "Nothing really," she said as she shrugged her shoulders for an air of unaffectedness. "Bachan and I were merely discussing some ere she fumbled, and it immediately piqued Kakashi's interest. Girl stuff," Naruko finished lamely, and he knew there was far more to the story than that which she had spoken of. He nodded his head anyways, as if in understanding, before a second Kakashi sprung up behind Tsunade and quickly dispelled the other Narukos. The Hokage coughed once around the smoke before rising out of the seat and storming towards Naruko. Naruko backed into Kakashi as he held her captive and flinched against his chest when Tsunade brandished an accusatory finger in her direction. "You?" she growled as she reached for Naruko's chin. "How dare you? You do not get to use secondary sealing jutsus against your leader." And Tsunade's voice was even louder with the closeness and felt a lot like crumbling stones. The headache that threatened to bloom before him now bore thorns. He mourned for the days of peace and quiet when Naruko studied her books and the Hokage signed treaties. Today, he wept, was not one of those days. Naruko's ire flashed and rose from her form like heat, and Kakashi had half the mind to let her go before her own voice rang like glass in his mind. His ears were sensitive to sound, and the decibels with which the two women were arguing were too high for his liking. He mentally beseeched Naruko to retain her composure, but she did not seem to receive the signal. "I had to," she yelled, and Tsunade's glare hardened even further. "This is ridiculous. You were going to tell Hai," and she froze, still as a statue, as her mouth fell closed with an audible snap. Kakashi eyed her sideways as he took the moment to bepize her composure. She did not move to meet his gaze, but a flush dotted her cheekbones. Her eyes shimmered with desperation as she looked into Tsunade's amber-colored orbs, and Kakashi could not help but to fall into the trap that laid before him. He knew that whatever was going on would involve him and his assistants in some way, would put more work onto his plate and aggravate him as everything involving Naruko was wont to do. Even still, the flush and the stillness and the overwhelming need to alleviate any of her discomfort caused him to shift his gaze from his student to that of the Hokage. Tsunade's form went from rigid to something akin to a victor. Her glare molded into an air of mockery and satisfaction, and the grin that lingered on her lips appeared unfriendly but riddled with amusement. Her stance spelled trouble, but Kakashi regarded her anyways. "Tell me what, exactly?" he lazed, and Tsunade's smile widened. "Naruko," she intoned, and Naruko shook her head in one last attempt at begging Tsunade to remain silent. She allowed haughtiness to take reign as she claimed 1 minute of triumphant silence before she finished answering Kakashi's query. "Naruko does not know how to dance." Kakashi's mind fumbled around the Hokage's answer as he tried to establish sense to the syllables. All of this, he faltered, the clones and the yelling and the woman practically buried against his chest for the one shred of truth that said woman couldn't dance. What source of foolishness had sunken some of the most powerful beings in the world to this kind of ridiculousness? He spared himself one astonished look at Naruko before returning the same to Tsunade, who emanated smugness in waves. "What?" was all he could muster, as incredulity had turned his other thoughts into ones too inappropriate for the Hokage's office. "Yes," she spoke around a laugh, "Naruko can't dance. And you, Kakashi, are going to teach her." At this he let Naruko go, and she did not waver from where she stood, frozen by Tsunade's order. Kakashi brought his gloved hands up before him, in a guise of surrender, before shaking his head. "I can't," he spoke hurriedly, shifting his attention between his blonde-haired student and the tawny-haired Hokage. "Tsunade, I can't, I'll find someone else." Shikamaru maybe, and Tsunade took one threatening step towards him. "Are you," she spoke with a voice bearing the edge of a blade, "are you denying a direct order from the Hokage, Kakashi?" And at this Naruko turned, her blue eyes filled to the brim with unshed tears. He wondered how often he had to bear witness to a sight like this one, her ocean-hued eyes swimming with tumultuous waves. He hitched his breath, feeling as if he were drowning, and then heard his relent to Tsunade's question before he registered that he had made the decision. "No," he sighed, "no Hokage-sama, I am not," and then Naruko wilted where she stood, and he watched as her shoulders slumped in defeat. Tsunade moved forward, and with a smile that was too brilliant for the sight of the poor girl before him, placed her hands on their shoulders and shoved them together. She stepped back and nodded her head, and the words that followed held all the finality of an ending. "Good, good," she intoned, "yes, you two will suffice. You two will open the dance at the Sakura festival this weekend," and as if she could sense his impending refusal, she cleared her throat before continuing, "I trust a week is enough time, no?" Kakashi shook his head in an attempt to reason with her, but Tsunade bore no pity. "You'll have to find a way to manage anyways, Kakashi." And that, he knew, was her cue for dismissal. Kakashi folded a steady palm against Naruko's back, guided her to the door, and exited the Hokage's office, all the while contemplating all the ways out of Konoha and whether or not he'd extend the offer to flee to Naruko. They continued on in quiet thought and wound their way to Naruko's apartment, not noticing the odd looks of the villagers that were not used to seeing the two so listless. Naruko unlocked her door without checking that Kakashi followed her in and proceeded to put on a pot to boil for some tea. It was only after pouring the 2 cups and placing one in front of Kakashi that she acknowledged his presence at all. "Omen, sensei," I tried to reason with her, but she was insistent. As she spoke, she moved to sit across from him. She all but fell into her chair and then moved her hair across her shoulder before running her fingers through it, an act he knew she only did when she was anxious. She could never be still for long, and he watched as the tresses yielded to her ministrations like liquefied gold. For a moment he was breathless, stricken once again by the gold pooling in her lap. Her downcast eyes held the tinge of the night sky. They had never borne that shade of navy before, and they were swimming with trepidation. He leaned across the table to put an end to her actions, and tan fingers found themselves enclosed within a gloved hand. She sighed before lifting her eyes to meet his own, and distantly he begrudged her need to hesitate before doing so. He was not the one who put them in this predicament, and he had a few choice words for the person who had, but both respect and obligation forced him to yield to the circumstance. "Nah, Naruko," he drawled, "it isn't your fault. Tsunade just enjoys exercising her power when the days are slow." He attempted a grin, though his mask belied the effort. Naruko shook her head, her blonde bangs sashaying against her forehead before falling in place again as she spoke. "That isn't it, sensei," and her voice held the heaviness of resignation. "Hinata-chan taught me to dance once. It isn't that I don't know how to," and as she continued, her fingers tightened around his own, "it's just that I can't. Not in front of everyone, not with them watching me." Kakashi did not miss the slight rise to her voice, nor did he fail to notice the increase of pressure against his palm. He brushed his thumb against the back of her hand in an attempt to comfort her. He begrudged Tsunade not for the first time that day, and he ground his teeth when he realized it wouldn't be the last. His following words were devoid of the frustration and instead bore all the care that he could muster. Now, Naruko," he soothed, "you know you can do anything. You've proven that more times than I can count." At this, Naruko unwound her fingers from Kakashi and rose from her seat. Her hands knotted themselves into her hair and clenched, and the strain of such an act was evident on her knuckles. Her barely restrained strength worried him, as he was rather fond of her tresses and did not want them uprooted from her head. She started pacing in a feeble attempt to vent some of her stress, and her teeth ground around the effort of addressing him. "Sensei," she growled, "this isn't a matter of protecting anyone, this," and at this moment, much to Kakashi's relief, she unwove her hands from her hair in order to wave them around in exasperation. "This is ridiculous. This is parading me around in front of everyone in some stupid dress and some stupid heels, and just waiting for me to fall." Her voice was an octave higher now and grated on his ears. He hid a flinch as he unraveled himself from his own seat. He eyed her warily, slightly unnerved at her wild ministrations before he silently moved towards her. Her right hand arced over his head and he caught it in its descent, his pale fingers secured around it in order to keep it prisoner. She turned, startled at his speed, and nearly bumped into him. Seizing the opportunity, his other hand brushed along the small of her back, pressing her closer into his frame. A quiet eep whispered against his chest as her left hand fell upon his shoulder. And, like a flame to candle wax, Naruko melted beneath his touch. He ignored the shrill of victory that reverberated in his spine and instead tucked Naruko's head beneath his chin. He reveled in the smallness of her stature, how her lips whispered against his throat and her breath ghosted across his skin. Kakashi shifted his weight and Naruko responded, stepping backwards to his gentle lead. They continued like this in quiet succession, and the repetition molded her closer against him. For what seemed like an eternity, they swayed back and forth, two specters dancing in the light of a setting sun. He pulled back from her for just a moment and she lifted her chin to meet his gaze. The fading light haloed around her form and sunk into the golden strands of her hair, gilding it with all the hues of an ember. Her eyes shimmered with captured light and held the depth of the Caspian Sea. Her lips were tainted rose, her cheeks were stained crimson. He envied the sun for its closeness to her skin and longed to press his lips to it in order to douse her with shadows. She was resplendent and outer-worldly, and he knew he was lost to her forever. He felt the full weight of defeat in those eyes, for though she was caged in his embrace, she held the entirety of his heart in her hands. He watched as her eyes fell closed and soon found that his resolve fell with them. Between one heartbeat and the next, his mask was around his neck and his lips were on hers, gentle and soft as petals. She sighed into him and it sounded more like a breath of relief, and it was not lost on him. Her hands had moved to his chest and clenched the supple leather of his vest, and it was all the anchor he needed. The hand at the small of her back splayed and increased its pressure, forcing every inch of her to press into him, and it still was not close enough. His other hand wove around the base of her neck, entangling itself in her hair. She rose to deepen the kiss and he lost control. He wanted more, needed more, and soon he found her mouth opening to his own. His brain turned to mush. He had never been so undone before, never felt as if his veins were replaced with live wire. Every inch of his skin that touched hers felt as if it was being burned, and he could not find it in him to care. She could turn him to naught but ash, and he would thank her, worship her, and beg her to do it again. She breathed his name and it tasted like hallelujah on his tongue, and he was never one to be religious, but there was glory in the way she responded to his touch. She gasped and he pulled back, forgetting oxygen in the haze of his emotions. Her eyes were glazed over, her face was flushed, and his heart hammered behind his ribs. Distantly he wondered if she could feel it before realizing that the sun had finished setting. She was more luminous than blazing, now that the gray of twilight had pooled across her skin. He leaned down for another kiss and stole one, two, and a third before taking a step back. Every ounce of him mourned the distance, but he doubted his capability to restrain himself if she remained so tantalizingly close to him. Her hands relaxed on his chest and he bent his forehead to hers in an attempt to regain his composure. He wanted to keep her like this forever, folded in his arms. Safe, sound, and so damn beautiful that it nearly broke his heart. She smiled up at him through hooded eyelashes and a wealth of happiness washed over him. He flashed her his own grin and felt as she gulped at the sight of him. He appreciated the effect he had on her, cherished it, and for a moment the world spun in leisure peacefulness before her lips parted and she spoke around the silence. "Nah, sensei," she giggled, "I'm not so certain this is what Hokage-sama had in mind." And as the playfulness took reign over the situation, Naruko vanished from his arms before he could anticipate her trickery. He inelegantly stumbled forward twice before regaining his footing and turned haphazardly in the direction of her voice. A millisecond later, and she was perched on the countertop, her head titled sideways in a mock of innocence. The flush was still evident along her collarbones, but otherwise both had seemed to regain enough propriety to forestall any further complications to their relationship. He stood up straight and arched a long arm behind his own hair, sweeping his hand along the back of his head in order to feign his own ease. It was a gesture she had known well, what he had adopted to stall heady circumstances and allow for enough time to come up with an escape plan. He knew she recognized the act and had no wish to miss out in the events they shared, and as such, he offered a bow to the woman bracing herself in the kitchen. "Shall we try again, Naruko?" At this, her head straightened and she stiffened as if she sensed a trap. Practice makes perfect, after all. He drawled, and before she could shake her head no, he had already grabbed her from off the counter and adjusted her into something akin to a waltz. Naruko was not one to be offset and had an abundance of annoyance to expel. Soon there were 5 of her and in response, Kakashi created 5 clones to partner with them and copy his and her movements. Sensing a challenge afoot, Kakashi rendered 11 more shadow clones. She acquiesced to his challenge and pretended an air of indifference, however Kakashi experienced far too many of her pranks to ever fall for such guile. They had just finished a set of twirls before Naruko inundated her apartment with well over 100 clones. The number continued increasing until he was body to body with all of his clones and suffering under the force of maintaining the copies. The pressure increased unbearably so, and he dispelled them in puffs of smoke before falling to his knees and gasping for breath. Only then did Naruko take mercy on him and eradicate the rest of her copies. She held a steady palm out to him, but he declined the offer. He wrapped his hand around her own and instead went backwards. His velocity forced her with him, and soon they were laying side by side on her wood floor. Her head rolled onto his shoulder, and the two found themselves bathed in the light of a waning moon. For a minute, Naruko was speechless as Kakashi doused in all the hues of silver was enough to make him appear impermanent. She felt as though one blink would remove him from her skies entirely, as if he was composed of starlight, as if he could fall from her forever. As such, she felt the need to fold one arm against his chest in a desperate attempt to assure herself of his heartbeat. Only then did she relax against his form, and the process did not go unnoticed by Kakashi. She paused as if tasting her words, do you really feel up to this, Kakashi? And for the first time in a very long time, Kakashi found himself unwilling to hesitate. His response was instantaneous. His voice was as weightless though he spoke with such gravity, of course, he exhaled, we've witnessed the world as it fell to its knees, why can't we bear this, too? He chuckled, a light and airy sound, Naruko, you saved the planet and all those in it, and you wrought love where hatred once reigned. You're the epitome of hope. At this, he pressed a quiet kiss to her temple, you are the symbol of beginning, of renewal, of persistence. You could dance like a chicken and people would watch. He smiled then, and she felt his grin as it formed against her skin. After losing loved ones in the war, the villagers need these festivals to help them continue. They need you to guide their growth. I will be here to help you rise to their necessity. You can falter and I will steady you. I will not change my role in your life, regardless of circumstance. Naruko settled herself into his form, closed her eyes, and nodded her head. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she spoke next, I need you, she confessed, and her words were sluggish with the weight of sleep, I need you. He tucked her closer against his form and felt as his eyes fell closed before he gave them his permission. Exhaustion had caught up to him, and as sleep doused his world in darkness, his voice echoed into the abyss, I need you too. They woke the next morning in the hands of embarrassment, but soon fell into the familiarity of training. It was simple to conform to old history. Maintain a schedule, perfect moves, and utilize them when the situation necessitated it. Naruko and Kakashi practiced the routine for 5 days straight. On the 6th, they endured the grueling process of having their wardrobe set in place. On the 7th, the two of them performed in front of the entire village. To all who witnessed it, it was as peaceful as a receding tide, beauty untethered to all but gravity. Naruko glided and ebbed as if she embodied the waves, and Kakashi stepped as if he turned the earth beneath his feet. She was radiant, clothed in all the colors of the morning sky, while Kakashi bore all hues of nighttime. The two dazzled as reigning heavenly bodies. Watching them dance was akin to bearing witness to the brilliance of an eclipse, and sun met moon with the full yearning of all the hours between them. Their dance ended and the entire audience mourned for more. And though every villager eyed the two with longing, Naruko and Kakashi only beheld one another. The dance floor opened to everyone else, and the evening passed without a hitch. Naruko and Kakashi turned to Tsunade, who nodded her head in gratitude and permission for their departure. The two disappeared in a flume of smoke, sly enough to not draw the attention of anyone else. The music never faltered, the lanterns never dimmed, and many couples danced until the very beginning of dawn. For what felt like centuries, Konoha experienced one night of pristine serenity. And who better to start it but the woman who had saved Konoha in all of its entirety, and the man who had ultimately saved her. The two were sequestered away back at Kakashi's apartment. He had made both of them cups of ramen before regrettably offering her some of his old clothes for pajamas. She readily agreed and scrambled into the bathroom to shower and change. When she came back into the room, Kakashi had a gulp. She was weaving her hands through her unbound hair in an attempt to detangle it. That which wasn't ensnared between her fingers hung tightly against her, soaking her clothes so that they stuck to her frame. Her curves caught the moonlight and shadowed the rest of her form, rendering her ethereal. He wondered how it was possible that someone could still look more beautiful now than when she was draped in intricate fabric, makeup, and hair ornaments. It was then he realized that it was because only he saw her like this, in her most unguarded state, deprived of all her boisterous personality that she showed to all others. Here with him, Naruko was more flame than wildfire. She was calm and gentle, sincere about strengths and fears, and open and honest with her insecurities. Here she wore her heart instead of her armor, and upon realizing this, he had a desperate need to shield her all over again. He walked over to her and folded her in his arms. He picked her up, startled by how slight she seemed, and brought her over to the couch. He settled her into it before leaving to grab the brush she left on his bedroom dresser all those nights ago. He returned to her and she eyed the brush with relief before extending her hand in a silent request for it. He shook his head before sitting next to her. She turned to ask him vocally for it but was silenced when he gently forced her away from him. "Kakashi," she growled, frustrated at the seemingly senseless point of his actions. Her back was to him now and he could feel the rigidity in her spine. He hid a laugh before raising the brush and running it along her strands, careful to not pull on a tangle. She flinched in surprise before relaxing into him and the soft cushions beneath her. He repeated his ministrations with tender care, admiring how soft her hair was even when it was wet. It yielded to him easily, and before too long it bore no tangles. Though his beginning task was complete, he continued his actions, relishing in the intimacy of the moment. Unbeknownst to him, Naruko had fallen asleep halfway through his progress. She was too at ease and too tired to resist slumber's embrace. An hour passed before she breathed his name in her sleep, and Kakashi answered her only to realize she had been dreaming. He yawned and checked the clock above his door and could not fathom how it had come to be 6 in the morning. He contemplated moving her to his bed but decided it was best to stay put. He rubbed the back of his hands over his eyes and pulled down his mask, relaxing further into the cushions. He did one last stroke through her long hair before leaning backwards. As he fell once more into the arms of sleep, the brush tumbled out of his hands. Naruko woke and was taken aback by morning light. She turned hurriedly, worried for Kakashi, before her eyes landed on the man quietly snoring next to her. She smiled fondly at his position. His mask was down, his lips were slightly parted, and one of his hands was still interwoven in her hair. The brush laid on the floor next to his feet and she buried a laugh before it woke him. He must have tended to her to the very last moment until sleep had won the war. She was stiff from the awkward position she was laying in and rose as noiselessly as possible in order to crack her joints. She was faced with a dilemma upon realizing that she probably shouldn't make a habit of staying overnight with her sensei. She should sneak home, crawl into her own bed in her own room in her own apartment, and she frowned at the amount of displeasure that washed over her at the notion of such an idea. She scoffed it away, shrugged her shoulders, and returned to her place upon the couch. She eyed Kakashi as she did so in order to not disturb him, but was caught by surprise when she noticed just how young he looked. His hair was the color of snow, his skin pale as if it held the light of the moon, and there was an imperceptible dusting of freckles across the planes of his cheeks, so unnoticeable that it was almost like a secret. He reminded her of a child napping in the sun, unaware of the world that looked upon him. Her breath hitched when she realized he carried the weight of an eternity of loss in his eyes, and it was that alone that made him seem aged beyond his years. Her heart twinged at the thought as she pressed a light kiss to his forehead, careful not to let her now dry hair fall against him. As she curled up beside him, nuzzling into the security of his form, Naruko realized just how deeply Kakashi was entrenched in her heart. And, as she counted his heartbeat at 7 in the morning, Naruko wondered if this is what it meant to be in love. The sixth time it happened, Kakashi was sitting before 2 cooling bowls of ramen at Ichiraku's, having already ordered one for his student as he awaited her arrival. An orange-bound book, one of the Icha Icha series, sat well worn between his gloved hands as he sighed tiredly into the pages. It was not like his student to leave him waiting, but he imagined she had earned a few lost on the road of life excuses, a habit he had hoped he didn't pass on to his team in the wake of all their years together. The annoyance caused an unnoticeable twitch in his jaw. He was lifted from his inward musings as Tucci asked him if he would like to have his bowls heated up. The old man's furrowed brow offset Kakashi enough for him to check the clock on the residing wall. He could not suppress the frown that resulted from the realization that she was half an hour late. Nodding his head in assent, he tried to stifle the ire that rose within his chest. She had never made him wait this long before, and distantly he imagined her arriving before him flustered and apologetic. Perhaps she'd wrap her arms around him and he'd relent to her warmth. The relief at having her back in his life would be too great to ever remain annoyed for long. As the bowls were placed once more before him, he decided to forgive her for trying his patience and returned once more to his book. Another 15 minutes later and Kakashi had to still his tapping foot. Anxiety was threatening to undo his indifferent composure as the book sat unattended to on the bar top. His jaw was taut with the grinding of his teeth and the dull ache did little to assuage his panic. He tried to establish her tardiness to a simple act of forgetting, but he knew she was too intelligent and too aware to ever forget prior engagements. He wondered if something came up or if someone else had occupied her afternoon, but she valued relationships too much to not inform someone of a change in plans. She never wanted someone to feel abandonment and always asked for rain checks when things went awry. Perhaps most importantly, he decided, she never went back on her word, and that left him far more worried when it appeared that, for the first time, she had. The line of thought had stricken tension throughout his countenance. Pale fingers bit into the edge of the bar as it yielded to his strength, caving in on itself beneath the weight of his worry. Noticing this, he all but slammed more change than necessary between the two bowls and stormed out of Ichiricus. He barely managed an apology before the flaps fell still in the wake of his departure as he stomped his way towards his student's residence. Arriving at her house, he vented some of his anger out in a series of loud and insistent knocks against her door, his sense of propriety lost in the wake of his frustration. The door yielded before him. He blinked once, startled out of his tirade. His eyes scanned hurriedly across the apartment that lay open before him. She had never forgotten to secure her living space. One too many incidents occurred when she was young to ever let her forget how invaluable locks were against the common man, and old habits, especially ones carved from fear, were impossible to cease. Kakashi took a hesitant step forward as he stifled the chill of panic that nestled in his spine. The living room appeared to be in order as he catalogued the unbroken valuables that sat still and silent on their thrones. Her residence had always been sparsely decorated, and he appreciated her simple tastes, for she preferred free space rather than luxuries. It suited the both of them to have the extra room, and he valued that her years prevented him from having to throw away spoiled milk and empty raiment cartons any longer. The moment of serenity and fond memories came to a jolting halt as he noticed just how unnaturally still her apartment was. The afternoon sun had stagnated upon the floor, heavy in its fall. His hand trembled on the knob as he turned it and opened the door to her room. Her bed was made, her clothes were folded, and her plant upon the windowsill had been freshly watered. Everything was as it should be, except for the door to her master bathroom had been left askew. He all but ran into the room, tripped over the doorframe, and stumbled onto the tile floor, hitching his breath as his eyes finally caught sight of his student. She laid in a crumpled heap upon the tile floor, her golden hair cascading around her like freshly fallen petals. She was still in her pajamas, those green frogs that grinned up at him belied the severity of the situation. Her face was contorted in something akin to pain, but she did not move. He breathed her name as if it were a prayer, and his voice rose louder and more insistent as desperation took hold of his tongue. He shook her to wake her and choked around a breath when those blue eyes did not open to meet his pleas. He pressed his ear to her chest and prayed to all the heavens for a heartbeat. When a weak knock rose to meet his ears, he clumsily lifted her up in his arms as anxiety steeled his actions. He looked down at her face just once in sheer need to memorize the curve of her jawline, the fullness to her lips, the golden lashes that brushed against her cheekbones. The breath that followed was sharp and unforgiving as he teleported them to the office of one very startled Hokage. Her eyes fell upon the body nestled in his arms, and in the following second, a steady palm was pressed gently to her goddaughter's forehead. A flash of green soothed over Naruko's skin as she beepized her vitals, and a resulting frown quietly marred the Hokage's features. She tugged once on her goddaughter, lifting Naruko as if she were made of porcelain. Kakashi was shaking as he handed her his student and flinched when her insistent voice boomed out orders. She commanded him to wait where he was as she disappeared from the room with his precious person folded in her arms. With nothing left to anchor him, Kakashi fell to his knees. He was set adrift in a sea of despair, the guilt and pain threatened to drown him. Teeth tore into the side of his cheek and drew blood as he clenched his jaw. He knew better than to not search for her after 10 minutes of being late. Had he listened to his judgment the first time he noticed her unusual tardiness, he might have been there sooner and prevented her current state. She would not have been alone or helpless, she would be smiling at him, soothing his brow, giggling as consternation and a wealth of affection washed across his chest. He resented his lack of judgment, and the remorse sat like lead in the pit of his stomach. Before long, the door behind him opened with a quiet groan, as if it, too, was burdened by the weight of Kakashi's turmoil. Tsunade could feel the agony that rolled off of the man that knelt before her, the mountain crumbling from within its own walls. She paused only for a moment, the gravity of the situation necessitating the act before she forced her limbs to wade through its heaviness. Kakashi, she breathed as she knelt before him, gentle hands lifting his chin so he would meet her eyes. Kakashi, you couldn't have known, she soothed as he flinched at her touch, her fingers warm and soft against his skin. He thought she should slap him for his failure, for letting Naruko down. The thought caused a frown to break across his face. Her fingers moved to run over his brow in attempt to ease some of his tension. She's in good hands now, she will be okay. She watched as his shoulders sagged, some relief found in the knowledge that Naruko was still alive. What is wrong with her? His hoarse voice rose to disturb the silence as he shook around the question, too afraid of the answer to remain calm. He had never been so unnerved before, never felt so helpless. Sensing this, Tsunade pulled him hastily in an embrace in a desperate attempt to keep him together. "We don't know," she breathed against the top of his head, arms tightening around him, as if to bleed some of her calmness into his form. "She is not responding to any of our tests." He pulled away from her comfort, and she found difficulty in meeting the horrified look to his eyes. "Why not?" he gasped, pain strangling his words. "Why isn't she? How isn't she?" Tsunade shook her head, wrapped her hand around his wrist and lifted him to his feet. He staggered and she steadied him though his form wilted where he stood. Stillness would not do for Kakashi, she realized, he needed to see Naruko. "We are working on answering those questions, Kakashi," she stated as she guided him out of the office. "It appears that Kurama has fallen asleep inside of her, so we cannot use any of her chakra channels to bepize her. We can only use the Byakugan to ensure proper functioning, and outside of a slowness to them, everything seems to be in working order," she continued as they arrived at the hospital wing. His quiet steps behind her were the only acknowledgement that he was still with her. "She is strong, Kakashi," she reminded him as they arrived before another door, and instantly the smell of wildflowers rose to meet him. His chest tightened painfully at the scent. He contemplated running because he couldn't bear to face the woman he had sworn to protect. Had he done as he promised, she would not be in this mess. The hand anchored him where he stood before it moved to open the door before him. "Whatever this is," she whispered now, not wishing to disturb the quiet of the room as she moved to Naruko's side, "she'll pull through it. She has too much to live for to let something like this keep her down for long." A fond smile crept upon her face as she ran her hand through her goddaughter's bangs. "She doesn't belong in here," Kakashi sighed as he moved around to the other side of the bed, his gloved fingers resting along his student's wrist as he counted her pulse. He exhaled a breath he didn't realize he was holding when the slow beat thrummed against his fingers. His following words were tight with remorse. "I should have known better." Tsunade leveled him with a glare, immediately putting an end to the sentence that was sure to follow. "I'll have no more of that, Kakashi," she whispered between clenched teeth. "She does not need your self-pity." What is done, but the harshness of her tone ebbed from her voice when she saw how his fingers trembled against her goddaughter's wrist. "Kakashi was afraid. She needs your faith in her, Kakashi, she needs your support." She bent down to press a kiss to Naruko's forehead, lingering as if to instill her own strength into her loved one. "She needs you to be here when she wakes. Because she will wake." She pulled away from her goddaughter, hesitation marring her fluidity only. She glanced back at his quivering form, watched as his lips continued counting her pulse in devoted silence, and moved to take one last look at her goddaughter before she quietly left the room. She let one tear betray her strength as she hastily wiped it away. It was natural to worry over a loved one, she excused and proceeded to steel the rest of her nerves. She set off for the hospital labs, determined to pore over old documents in order to procure a cure for her loved one. It took 27 minutes, or 1,485 of Naruko's precious heartbeats, before Kakashi came out of his stupor. He looked around the room, startled at not finding Tsunade present anywhere, and then returned his attention to the hand beneath his fingers. It was paler than he last remembered and resembled the white hospital sheets too closely for his comfort. Her skin did not bear the fresh kiss of summer, but instead the frigid countenance of winter. He inhaled a shaky breath, remorse once more wreaking havoc throughout his body. The frail echo of her heartbeat in her wrist was not enough for him. He trailed his fingers up her forearm, hesitating at the crook of her elbow in order to find another pulse. Anxiety lessened its coils as the thrum registered beneath his fingers, and so he continued his ascent towards her shoulder. His hand was a ghost upon her skin, barely touching, as if it longed to bridge the distance and sink beneath the surface. His fingers took rein upon the arteries in her neck, and he held his breath as he waited. His entire being sagged at the steady beat that rose to meet his touch, and he shuddered as hope wove loving arms around his regretful and sorry heart. He brushed his fingers upon her cheek, yearning for the thousandth time that she would open her eyes and blush that becoming rose color once again. Perhaps then she would not be so still, so pallid, as if all the vibrancy of her existence was washed away, the fire extinguished to naught but the gray of ash. He sighed as he interwove his fingers through the bangs hanging limply upon her forehead, the once brilliant gold pooled as tarnished waves in the palm of his hand. He brushed them to the side and soothed them against the rest of her unbound hair. He then leaned down, pressed his lips to her forehead, and breathed a prayer to all that would listen for her to come out of this soon. This was a torment he could not bear, he beseeched. The sun that anchored his universe, about which all things orbited, had seemingly set from his world forever. The darkness that followed had stolen even the stars from his skies, and he knew that should she never wake again, he, too, would succumb to the shadows. He pressed a kiss upon each of her eyes, mourning the loss of their endless depths all over again, and swallowed down a sob as he straightened up and away from her. It was with great effort that he tore his gaze from Naruko's frozen features and turned once more to survey the room. He spotted a well-worn chair that seemingly melted into the shadows, as if it, too, regretted the visage of the woman laying before it. He weakly grabbed its arm and dragged it to her side and all but crumbled into its embrace as despair weighed on him with crushing defeat. Trembling hands clung desperately to Naruko's as all composure finally rid itself of Kakashi. And 35 minutes later, or after 1925 of Naruko's precious heartbeats, Kakashi bowed his head to the back of Naruko's hand and wept. Sleep settled mercifully upon Kakashi. He dreamt of a blue so deep and confounding that he could not put a name to it, could not find an equal. He dreamt of sunlight pooling across every sharp edge, soothing it into something gentle. He dreamt of quiet smiles and twinkling laughter, of stars that never fell, of the world rotating around a fixed point that never faltered, never fumbled, never left his universe. In his dreams, there were no white bedsheets, no hands that glowed green, no loss. In his dreams, he was laughing, cleaning the dishes, smiling at an entity that glowed blue and gold and glimmering. In his dreams, he was happy. Unfortunately for him, dreams did not last long. The small reprieve ended when a blanket melded against his form, when gray and red opened to the molten amber of Tsunade's. The starlight illuminated the unspoken concern. Thin fingers steadied his shoulder to prevent him from rising. "Take it easy," she whispered, an empathetic smile pulled at her lips, "I'm just ensuring you're warm. Try to get more rest, Kakashi, I will return in a few hours." He nodded his head in assent as she cupped his chin. "I know you're scared," she sighed as she moved to ruffle his hair. "I know how deeply worry has entrenched itself in your heart, Kakashi, but," she paused to press a kiss to his forehead, "you have to take care of yourself, too. It would not do to have her pull through only to discover you in the bed in the next room." As she pulled from him, she smiled fondly at his astonished expression. She did not hesitate to take advantage over his disorientation. She was certain that had he been more awake, he would not have allowed her the affection she bestowed upon him. But, she reasoned, one can always do with more people that love them. A full heart is a happy heart, and it was with this thought that she turned to brush a hand against her goddaughter's cheek. It glowed green for mere seconds at best, sinking beneath Naruko's skin as it pried once more at Kurama's cage. The stillness unsettled her enough to tempt her to take rein beside Kakashi and watch Naruko in her slumber, but she knew it would only hinder him. So, with a quick kiss and a hushed goodbye, Tsunade disappeared beneath the haze of smoke and left Kakashi to his careful observance. Kakashi finally unwound his hand from Naruko's and winced as he closed it to a fist. He tested the stiffness to the joints and cracked his knuckles until he felt less like a scarecrow made of wood and straw and more like a human. His eyes roved over the form before him and counted the rise and fall of her chest. Even beneath the white of the hospital sheets, her persistent breathing eased a small tendril of fear from his heart. He heaved a heavy sigh as he raked his hands through his hair, deciding for the umpteenth time that the entire situation was wrong. He leaned his head back to alleviate some of the tension that persisted due to the way in which he slept. His muscles groaned against his movements, but he paid no heed to them. His eyes fell unbidden on Naruko as if they hungered to memorize her stillness. He wanted to will her into wakefulness, but such a feat proved to be impossible. He closed his eyes in defeat and fell back into a dreamless sleep. In the morning, nurses took turns measuring her vitals, adjusting her pillows, and running a cool cloth over her skin. He left for a short while to bring her flowers, after fearing he would go insane with the grayness to the woman and the room she was residing in. He only parted after Tsunade promised she would not leave Naruko until he returned. He spent the few minutes out to find flowers that held a mere fragment of her scent and returned to her side. He placed them on the bedside table, admiring the splash of color amidst the dreariness, and envisioned the smile she'd reward him with had she been awake. Such a smile would assuage the lead in his heart for all of the remorse that had heavied it. Such a smile would bring him to his knees out of gratitude for her sheer life once more blooming before him. Such a smile would take him home, regardless of placement. He missed her, longed for her so desperately that it caused a dull ache to take root in his soul. News of Naruko's peculiar ailment traveled quickly through Konoha, and there was not a citizen unaffected by it. There was a heaviness that settled upon the village, a weight that burdened even the youngest children. All festivals were cancelled, preparations were waylaid, and villagers petitioned the Hokage for whatever aid they could offer. Lines that wrapped around houses and circumvented the village were endured for the practiced response of, "There's nothing we can do." Tsunade was at once both exhausted and in awe of the devotion they displayed for Naruko. Years ago, she knew, they would have lined up to put the child in further harm. Nowadays, they offered everything they had to their names for her. They would turn from the Hokage and weep, and never in the history of Konoha had the ground ever borne more salt from tears and the burden of fallen knees. Few were allowed to visit Naruko. Though loved by all and friended by many, only the closest were allowed to see her. Kiba took one look at the gray statue in the bed before growling and breaking the doorframe as he slammed it on the way out. Shino stood as still as a mountain, made not one sound or attempted a word, and did not acknowledge Kakashi before he, too, left. It was only the tension in his spine that told Kakashi how affected he was over Naruko's state. Shikamaru talked to her, ran careful hands through her hair, tucked her in. He knelt close and spoke as if he was telling her a secret, but Kakashi could hear the plea in his words, the begging, the hope. Shikamaru had lost far too many, and the fear and worry belied his quiet voice. Before exiting, he reminded Naruko that he would never get to advise the Hokage if she did not rise to the seat and ask him to do it. He shook his head and called her troublesome, an endearment reserved for her alone. It was too much for Kakashi to bear when Shikamaru could no longer hold in his tears. He knew the two were like brother and sister and could feel Shikamaru's suffering as if it were his own. When Shikamaru left, his sorrow remained in the air and it made the simple act of breathing nigh impossible for Kakashi. The following visitors were easier for him to bear. Lee was enthusiastic and hopeful, his words were insistent upon her strength and tenacity. It was refreshing for Kakashi. The barely tolerable spawn of Guy had somehow filled the room with enough hope to survive the endeavor. When he left, Kakashi almost believed him, almost smiled, almost laughed. Neji came afterwards. His eyes strained beneath the Byakugan as he raked them over her form over and over again. Kakashi had to tell him it was futile after 10 minutes of determined surveillance. When Neji relented, there was something akin to breaking in the way he sighed. He did not touch Naruko, but Kakashi could feel the despair that Neji wore like a suit of armor. He was guarded from this hurting by wearing it like a shield, but Kakashi could measure the cost. Neji left the room with a will to his step and a blade to his heart all the same. Tenten could not walk into the room without weeping. She took one step past the ruined door and immediately turned and ran. Kakashi could not blame her. Had he possessed any sense of self-preservation in his being, he might have done the same. Ino was harder to bear and caught Kakashi by surprise. She walked in as silent as a ghost. Kakashi might have missed her had she not breathed, "Oh," Naruko under her breath, those 4 syllables held all the undoing that her steady form beguiled. She laid a peony flower against Naruko's chest, a symbol of healing, before she kissed Naruko's cheek and left the room. It was a silent affair, but it was enough to leave a scar on his already weary heart. Choji sat outside the room. He could not come in but would not leave, and instead brought Kakashi food that a nurse hesitantly handed to him. A note bearing the words "thank you" was resting atop the platter, and the meaning was not lost upon Kakashi. Choji was not strong enough to face Naruko's illness, but he recognized and appreciated Kakashi's vigilance in overseeing his dear friend. Kakashi nodded to the note, well aware that Choji would never see his response, but somehow felt as if it was resolved all the same. Sakura and Sasuke came together, their hands intertwined to hide the trembling. Kakashi turned away from the scene, his heart was heavy enough. He heard Sakura fall to her knees and could tell when the sheets were displaced as Sakura buried her head against Naruko. He listened as Sasuke's hand fisted around the bedpost, the entire frame buckling beneath the pressure. Kakashi could taste the rust of anger and resentment and remorse that ebbed off of him. There would be no resolution between him and Naruko should she leave this world, and though Sasuke said not one word, he did not need to for Kakashi to understand. Naruko had to live. Naruko was one of his important people. Naruko was his equal. Naruko was his friend, his sister, his test of his strength, the last of his family. There would be nothing without her, and Sasuke's agony threatened to rip a scream from Kakashi's throat. He had his own unraveling, he did not need to bear Sasuke's, too. Sakura's sobs turned to tearless gasps that strangled her throat. When those settled to whispers of agony, Sasuke half carried and half dragged an unwilling Sakura from Naruko's form. The pink-haired girl repeated Naruko's name as if it were a prayer, over and over again, each time more unbearable than the last. He could still hear her down the hall. He could hear her after she left. He could hear her even after he was certain she was home. She leveled Naruko's name with a brokenness that splintered in his brain, even when she was out of earshot. Hinata visited and stayed for an hour. She was the steadiest, the most unerring in her voice and actions. She brought in a chair, acknowledged him, and gently took one of Naruko's hands. Then, much to Kakashi's surprise, she read to her as if she was simply sleeping. Hinata bore none of the doubt that riddled the entirety of Konoha. She spoke with a certainty that could calm the seas. The sun had set 3 hours ago, and Kakashi found himself tired as he listened to her voice. Before long, his eyes fell close to the sight before him. Hinata was relieved when she noticed his slumber. There was no doubt in her entire form that Naruko would wake and smile once again, that she would hang every fallen star back atop its throne and douse all of Konoha with her brilliance soon enough. She had wanted to do something to ease the man who kept a careful watch over her hero and knew that reading would alleviate some of his turmoil. The quick kiss to her hero's forehead was all the luxury she spared herself before she rose to take her leave. As the door closed behind her, she said a prayer of gratitude towards the sky for Kakashi and Naruko having one another. Circumstance did not matter if the love was true, and the visit lent her to believe that it was. He was startled from his slumber when Tsunade burst into the room, gasped around his name in startled warning, and then remained open-mouthed and silent as Kakashi felt the full weight of murderous intent scathing throughout the room. Sand rose from the cracks in the wooden floor, and he understood the meaning behind it. He took one glance at Tsunade in silent request for her to remain with Naruko, and then disappeared from the room entirely. He appeared in a clearing behind the hospital. Across the way, a crimson-haired man turned and leveled Kakashi with a glare that would have stopped entire armies in its wake. He hid a shiver as Gaara's anger washed over him as wildfire, singing every ounce of his being with its resentment. It was merciless and all-consuming, and Kakashi did not need words to understand why. All the same, he nodded his head in polite greeting, feigning cordiality, if only to prevent Gaara from halting Konoha's restoration by uplifting the entire ground beneath it. "Gaara," Kakashi drawled lazily as he took a cautionary step towards him, "so nice to see you again. Pray tell, how is Sunagakure?" In an instant, Gaara was before him, hand against Kakashi's cheek in a punch that would have cracked bone had it been dealt with the intent to kill. Kakashi recoiled but did not fall, and as he straightened his spine and steadied his stance, he shrugged as he spoke around the blood that pooled in his mouth. Gaara. So quick these days," he sighed around the words, exhaustion belying his forced aloofness. "Feel better now?" His mocking had the desired effect. Gaara settled the angry granules of sand that kept buffeting Kakashi. He allowed some of the tension to leave him, and some of Gaara's resentment ebbed from his form. It was less oppressive, but he knew very well that one wrong word would undo it all, and when Naruko woke she would be very displeased to discover that the two had fought. He would take the punch and endure the conversation and hopefully bring Gaara to her room in a much more rational and less violent state of mind. Gaara's hands balled into shaking fists as he finally rose to meet Kakashi's eyes. Kakashi stiffened at the sight, as his sea-green eyes reminded him of Gaara's first visit to Konoha. They bore the sharp edge of unpolished emerald, and Kakashi could almost feel them cut through his person as they searched for answers he did not have. "I didn't hit you hard enough," Gaara's voice rose to disturb the silence, and felt like steel wool in Kakashi's head. "I should do a lot worse to you." His voice fell low and sounded like sifting sand, putting Kakashi on high alert. His stance shifted, there was more weight in his heels. "You promised me," he ground out between clenched teeth, "you promised me you would protect her." Gaara's eyes steeled over and darkened as he took a menacing step forward towards Kakashi. "Why is it then?" he whispered, and Kakashi felt the earth rumble. "Why is it that she is here, if you made such a promise?" The clearing fell silent as if it were holding its breath. Kakashi inhaled and choked around his following words. "I didn't know," he whispered, and his voice shook with remorse. "I did not know." Gaara and Gaara erupted. The ground lifted around them, groaning with agony as the surrounding trees were ripped from its belly. The wood splintered and joined the fray as sand turned tumultuously throughout the clearing. Not an inch was spared from the Rekage, and Gaara's howl of rage cut through the air like sharpened blades. "You did not know." He roared and lunged at Kakashi. "That is your excuse for this?" He yelled as he landed another punch against Kakashi's ribs, and Kakashi felt them break beneath the force. "That is why she is here." And a kick rang against his stomach, causing him to double over in pain. "You promised." He screamed as he ascended into the air, and a well-placed knee eyed it against Kakashi's chin. His head fell back and he saw the blue of the sky as he fell to the ground. It did not match her eyes, he mourned, but Kakashi did not move to stand. "You promised." Gaara broke around the words and the force of his anger followed suit. Torn trees thudded to the ground and sounded as hollow as the man that ripped them to shreds. Sand and stone rained upon the two of them, brushing against their skin in a quiet apology. Gaara could no longer bear to stand. Misery stole the fight from his limbs, forcing him to yield to its demands. He sat on the ground and brought his head to his knees. He took heaving breaths but could not bring himself to speak. Kakashi turned his head to the side, feeling the gravel give way beneath his cheek. It caught in the blood that poured down his face. Tired eyes fell upon the vision of a child in mourning, a red-haired man with shaking shoulders that belied his silent sobs. He could not pretend to understand the depth of Gaara's feelings for Naruko. She had lifted him from the darkness, carried him back from the dead, and befriended him in spite of all the blood on his hands. She had loved him, Kakashi knew, but it was born from the same loss, isolation, and desperation shared in their childhoods. Kakashi could not fault the two for being so attached, and though their friendship was shared across thousands of miles, he knew just how precious it was. She had risen Gaara from the destruction of loneliness and paved the path to love. Gaara embraced it wholly, had made amends with his people and most importantly his siblings, and took reign over Sunagakure. The village loved him and he them, but Kakashi knew he did it for her. Gaara wanted to deserve her friendship, needed it, craved it, and set out to pursue it. When he told Naruko this, she had kissed his cheek and giggled, telling him that he already had. The look he gave her was one leveled with both admiration and shock, and she took his hand and demanded Ichiraku's as compensation for Gaara's silliness. The memory felt so distant now, as if it existed somewhere beneath the horizon, buried with the rest of the light that disappeared. The minute Naruko had fallen still. Had he not been so spent already, he might have wept right there beside Gaara. Deciding that it was probably best to not be so distracted, Kakashi took note of his injuries instead. He pressed a hand to his side as he rolled to sit up, hitching a breath as the pain tore at his body. Gaara lifted his head at the sound and watched as Kakashi cleaned the blood from his face, frowning at the amount. His eyes finally caught Gaara's and wordlessly expressed his distaste for the mess around them. He had liked this clearing, it was one seldom used by others and therefore perfect for his own contemplation. Now, it rested in tatters and Kakashi was not pleased. He had fully anticipated Gaara's resentment, but did not account for the volatility. Why? Gaara's voice sighed into the silence, filling it with a gentle baritone that no longer harbored the unforgiving grit of anger. Why did you not defend yourself, Kakashi? He watched as the silver-haired man shrugged his shoulders, an air of laziness once more settled about his frame. I figured I deserved it, Kakashi admitted as a fresh wound pulled at the stitches in his heart in the wake of his admittance. I let her down, I let you down, someone had to bestow the proper repercussions. Gaara eyed him warily, measuring the weight to his words. The haunted look in Kakashi's eye and the hidden rigidity in his spine made Gaara trust him. He rose from his seat and faltered only once before he turned to help Kakashi stand. Kakashi accepted the help but was stalled as Gaara rested a hand on his shoulder. You are an idiot, Gaara grinned, but the exhaustion and despair did not let the smile reach his eyes. I know, Kakashi wearily answered. He watched as Gaara bowed his head to stare at the ground. I am sorry, Gaara whispered, and the sincerity emanating off of him was tangible. I should not have accused you, I know. His breath hitched with emotion, and Kakashi found it hard to listen to his voice when it sounded so sad. I know you'd have helped her if you could. I know she is here and safe because of you, and he shook his head in an attempt to rid himself of the sorrow. But as he turned to meet Kakashi's gaze, torment churned in his eyes. Thank you, he said as he finished helping Kakashi rise, and the words held the weight of the world. Thank you for protecting her. And though Kakashi stood still as stone, it felt as if his heart had crumbled. The two limped their way through the darkened corridors of the hospital wing, as if beaten by more than the expenditure of energy and the heaviness of fists. They hesitated before the door to Naruko's room before opening it to reveal her unmoving form. Gaara flinched as if he were struck and took a step in retreat, but Kakashi's hand fell upon his upper back and all but forced him inside. When the two were clear of the frame, he sealed them in the silence of her hospital suite before returning to his chair. Gray and Crimson scanned Gaara's form in an attempt to ensure he would stay to pay his respects, but he could not focus for long. His gaze constantly fell to Naruko as he measured her breaths. He envisioned her opening her eyes and throwing her arms around Gaara, as she was wont to do whenever he returned to Konoha. He would stifle the ire and the jealousy if she would just lift herself from her slumber enough to cause it. Gaara stayed rooted to his spot before the sleeping girl. He could feel Kakashi's eyes flicker from him to Naruko, but did not find enough annoyance to care. There was only agony known to his heart as his beloved friend did not move to wrap her arms around his form, did not yell his name into his ears as if he were deaf, did not giggle against his chest as he held her in fond hello. She did not smile with unshed tears at the sheer joy of his presence. She did not ask him how everything fared, if he was healthy, if he was happy. She did not shackle his wrist as she all but drug him to Ichiraku's. No, instead she lay still as if made of stone. When his fingers finally moved to brush against her hand, he froze mid-action and winced at the cold. She was always warm to the touch, feverish, almost unbearable to be near for long, as if she was a flame that was too bright and too blinding that it would incinerate him where he stood. This stillness, this coolness, this silence, was not the woman he had come to love. The girl before him was not, could not be, his Naruko. When emerald eyes widened and fractured with horror, Kakashi cleared his throat to break the impending undoing. Gaara turned to him with more force than intended and stumbled before righting himself. Kakashi's whisper sounded hazy through Gaara's fear, but he caught the words all the same. Tsunade says she's alright, he droned on though he seemed far away, that she's stable, that she'll pull through. The words eased some of the fog that settled in Gaara's mind. Loneliness had clouded his judgment. He was quick to volatile anger and even quicker to despair. Hearing that she was stable soothed some of his turmoil and allowed him to think clearly. He jerked his head in a nod of understanding and returned his focus to Naruko. He called upon Shukaku in a silent request to see if he could pry at Kurama's door. When Shukaku's giggle faltered and ended in a frustrated grunt, Gaara's shoulders sagged in defeat. His voice came out gravelly, roughened by unshed tears and frustration. Even Shukaku cannot reach Kurama. Kakashi nodded heavily, the small ounce of hope he harbored fell to the pit of his stomach. Chakra channels can't seem to reach her. He sighed around his following words, exhaustion burdening his intonation with sluggishness. All we have is the Byakugan, and though she appears to be relatively unharmed, it doesn't help us see what is keeping her under. Gaara allowed his form to wilt as he regarded Kakashi. He was thankful to the man for keeping watch over Naruko, regardless of how futile it seemed. Dark circles haunted the space beneath his eyes, and there was a gauntness to his face. He was not sleeping, he noted, not well enough to rejuvenate him. So, Gaara did the only thing he knew to be beneficial to the both of them and allowed Shukaku to release enough chakra to lull Kakashi to sleep. It was sudden, without warning, and took very little energy as the white-haired Jounin casted him a startled and angry glare before sinking further in his chair as his eyes fell closed. Relief coursed through Gaara as he took rein upon the edge of the bed. With no audience to bear witness to his actions, he was free to release some of the anxiety that had built up inside of him. He did as Kakashi once did and measured Naruko's pulse, counted her breaths, and tucked her further into bed. He ran pale fingers through her tawny hair and longed for her vibrancy to illuminate the darkness of his world once more. He pressed his lips to her cheek and breathed her name against it, beseeching her to open her eyes. When her form remained unmoving beneath him, he nuzzled into her neck and wept like a child. The loneliness that bloomed in his chest bore nothing but thorns as it strangled his heart. He felt as if he were 6 years old again, as if love had betrayed him and threatened to end his life. He came up from her neck gasping for air, choking around her name as he swallowed the bile that rose in his throat. And then, all at once, Gaara fell still. His watery eyes caught sight of something he had not noticed before. A chain peeked up at him from the dip in her collarbone, glinting as if demanding his attention. He gingerly lifted it from the collar of her hospital gown and untangled it from the stone the Hokage had given her. It was a small necklace, but one Gaara recognized with astonishment. From the silver chain hung the glass charm he had given her years ago when she brought him back from the Akatsuki. When he had lifted her hand to shake it in a sign of companionship, he had nestled the gift against her palm. He did not think she would keep it, let alone wear it around her neck. He had made it himself, carefully, by soothing sand into the shape of the kanji symbol for friendship and heating it tenaciously until its golden granules liquefied to glass. He had let it harden and carried it around with him. It was in his pocket the very minute Shukaku was ripped from his chest. It was his anchor when his soul was adrift in the afterlife. It brought him home when she pulled him back from his ending. He valued it more than he valued anything in the world, and when he gave it away to her, it was akin to handing her his heart. Fondness soothed over him as he let the pendant fall beneath her collar once more. She must return his feelings to have worn the pendant so close to her heart, to have protected it all these years. Their friendship had withstood time and distance and the great tragedies of life. They had both come back from the dead and lived to see one another again. This time, he reasoned, would be no different. She would open her eyes, smile her smile, and lift the world into another daybreak. Shukaku and Kurama would once again laugh in easy camaraderie, and the hero of Konoha and the heart of Sunagakure would forever work together to maintain worldwide peace. This would not be where their friendship ended, he was certain of it. With one more kiss to her forehead, he lifted himself from the bed and left Kakashi to his rest. He found his way to Tsunade's office, offered fair compensation for the damage to the clearing, and thanked her for taking care of his friend. Tsunade's knowing smile unnerved him, but she nodded her assent for his departure and wished him and Suna well, promising to inform him of the very minute Naruko awoke. With a bow of his head and a quick oath to return again, Gaara disappeared in a whirl of smoke and sand, leaving the Hokage's office filled the brim with the scent of desert blooms. The end. So how was this part? I hope you like it. And if you like it, share this part with your friends and like the video too. And don't forget to subscribe our channel for daily awesome fanfiction. Okay, it's time for me to go. Bye bye.